Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. And we will now try to transition heroically from food to food for thought. I want to thank all of you for joining us for the roundtable on cyber risks. I'm very grateful to my friends and colleagues at the Penn Wharton budget model for the opportunity to address this critical issue. We have been writing about it in Knowledge at Wharton. For those of you who aren't familiar with what Knowledge at Wharton is, we are the online research and business analysis journal of the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. And our mission is to share knowledge from Wharton and other sources with everyone who wants to learn. And we do that at an unbeatable price. It's Knowledge at Wharton is and has always been completely free. So if you would like to read some of these articles on cybersecurity that we have, many of which were written by some of the experts who are on this panel, you could do that at knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu. Or if you want specific links, please let me know during the break, and I'll be very happy to send them to you. Now, we all know that cybersecurity is one of the most urgent challenges that the US and the world faces today. At the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, the Global Risks Report, which some of our colleagues at Wharton were involved in contributing to, they pointed out that cybersecurity risks are growing both in their prevalence and in their disruptive potential. The report went on to say that attacks against businesses have almost doubled in 5 years, and incidents that would have been once considered extraordinary are becoming more and more commonplace. The financial impact of cybersecurity breaches also is rising, and some of the largest costs in 2017 related to ransomware attacks, which accounted for 64% of all malicious emails. The famous examples, as you all know, include the WannaCry attack, which that impacted about 300,000 computers in 150 countries. And also NotPetya, which had quarterly losses of about $300 million for a number of affected businesses. In addition to these attacks and ransomware, the other growing trend, according to the report, is the use of cyber threats to target critical infrastructure and strategic industrial sectors. And this has raised fear that, in a worst-case scenario, attackers could trigger a breakdown in the systems that keep societies running. For those of you who heard David Sanger of the New York Times speaking on NPR this week about his book titled The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, this will come as no surprise. Sanger writes about the cyber attack against 200,000 Ukrainian citizens on Christmas Eve 2015, which was the work of Russian hackers. And that attack froze the computer screens of operators of the country's power grid. When they tried to revive their systems, the operators found that malware inserted into their systems would not let them do that. And Sanger argues in his book that many countries, including the United States, are vulnerable to such attacks. Now, I can go on and on with examples like this, but I'm not going to do that because we have a distinguished panel of speakers with us today, and they'll help us understand the nature of cyber risk as well as what should be done about it. I won't read out their bios because you should already have those in your materials. But the one thing I will point out about all of them is that what they're doing, they're special not just because of what they do today, but also because what their former roles have been. So let me introduce each of them in brief. To my immediate right is Ira Gus Hunt, who is the Managing Director and Cyber Lead of Accenture Federal Services and the former Chief Technology Officer of the Central Intelligence Agency. Daniel Kroese is next to him. He is now the Senior Advisor, National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security, and he was the former Chief of Staff for Republican Representative John Ratcliffe. David Lawrence is the founder and chief collaborative officer of the Risk Assistance Network and Exchange, or RANE, and former associate general counsel and managing director of Goldman Sachs, and also assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. To his right is Tim Murphy, president of Thomson Reuters Special Services, and the former deputy director of the FBI. And last but not least, we have Matthew Olsen, who's the president and chief revenue officer of IronNet Cybersecurity and the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Please join me in welcoming the panel to our talk today. So I'd like to open by one question for all panelists, and help us understand what you think is the state of the digital union today. How would you view the cyber threat landscape? And before you begin, I just have one suggestion, and that is our colleague at Wharton, Adam Grant, wrote recently a very interesting article about how to conduct less horrible panel discussions, in which he pointed out that what people remember in panel discussions is not data, but stories. So to the degree that you can incorporate the most vivid or perhaps the most scary story that you know about cybersecurity, which is perfect for a post-lunch session, nothing like cybersecurity to scare people, please go ahead and share your stories with us. Gus, you want to start?
I'm not sure people need help getting scared about cyber. Okay. So I think we're at a really interesting juncture in cybersecurity. If you look at what's happening right now, and for the past couple of years, we have this interesting phenomenon where we seem to be kind of holding our own. If you look at the studies done by Accenture and by Verizon and others, despite the fact of the increasing pace of attacks, we actually, through technology and things like that, have been stopping more and more of these attacks. And so if you look at cyber losses and things like that, it's actually been kind of steady state for about the last 2 or 3 years across the board, right? But I look at this as kind of the, I'll say with great suspicion is how I'll phrase it. You know, in cyber, I believe we are exhibiting the classic signs of insanity in the thing. And if you really think about where we are, I think we're kind of like the little boy with his finger in the dike. Oh, well, thank you. I was assuming these were controlled elsewhere. All right. Okay, do you guys want me to start over again, or no? I'm sorry. So like the little boy with his finger in the dike, and that things I think are about to get much, much, much worse, and it's going to happen very, very quickly and very, very suddenly. And this is driven by the Internet of Things, or the Industrial Internet of Things, and all the devices that we are connecting like mad into our systems and into our environments that we use to drive such great efficiencies and enable new forms of delivery to the citizens and things like that, are also the vulnerability points that are going to grow. And the problem is that because of these devices, the threat surface itself is going to expand by some 3 to 5 orders of magnitude, right? And so if I can leave you the scary story, what I'm going to tell you is that cyber is the most difficult threat environment the world has ever seen. It as a weapon system, is unlike anything previous in history today. The velocity of innovation around cyber itself is unparalleled, right? By one measure, all right, done several years ago, there is more malware released in a month than all legitimate code released in a year across the board, right? It's highly asymmetric, right? We've already seen this happen and cover things, but we're to the point now with cyber that not just nation states, but single individuals can wreak massive havoc by marshaling all of the available resources they can find on the dark web and pointing it at something and turning it loose to attack things. Right? And then it's also frictionless, right? And to me, this is the scariest possible thing that's out there. Cyber is the world's first frictionless weapon system. And what I mean by that is the moment something gets released and discovered in the wild, everybody's knowledge is suddenly elevated, and all these things get turned around to come back at us, right, in different ways. So you mentioned all the ransomware. Look at the number of variations that ransomware went to as people took them, modified them, reused them, relaunched them, and things like that. The same thing happened with Stuxnet. It was a matter of just matter of days after Der Spiegel did the decomposition of Stuxnet and published it out that the first variants of Stuxnet were coming back to attack ICS and SCADA systems here inside the United States. So when you really think about cyber, you got to think about it from the optic of how it actually operates. And if we think we've seen bad events, you know, in the past, I'm just very, very concerned that we've just started to see that it's the tip of the iceberg, not the bottom of it. Okay. Yeah.
Daniel?
I agree generally with the threat landscape that Gus presented there, but I think if there's any reason for optimism is that we are slowly but surely seeing an awakening of vigilance by the American people about this threat. And the anecdotes and the touch points I use there is for the last 3.5 years before I joined DHS, I was the chief of staff to a member of Congress who represented 18 rural counties in Northeast Texas. And I would go down there about once a month for 2 or 3 days and go to the Rotary clubs and the Kiwanis clubs and the rubber chicken dinners and the chambers of commerce and go on the whole civic society circuit where you're hobnobbing with real everyday Americans. And so did that, 40 or 50 times over 3.5 years with a pretty steady cadence. And when I first started out going, they wanted to talk about taxes or health care or the pothole on Main Street. But over those 3.5 years, between January of 2015 and then April of this year, a lot happened. And the first big one was Anthem, which attacked 80 million Americans and exposed some of the most sensitive personal information, your health care records. And then the OPM breach happened and showed that even some of the most sensitive government records are not immune to these kinds of threats. And then fast forward a few months after that, and you had the Mirai botnet, which took down a host of popular web services, including Netflix. And for most of the country, probably nothing sort of violates more deeply the 21st century living than if your Netflix goes down. So that's very real to folks. And then you had the WannaCry, NotPetya ransomware attacks a few months after that. And then 57 million Uber users had their information exposed. And then it culminated with Equifax and close to 150 million records. And for many Americans, that was different because they never signed up for that. With a lot of these other services, they at least at some point knew that they had put information in some system, but this was something they hadn't signed up for. And so you sort of go across that and look at, we're not talking 100,000 here, 100,000 there, but we're talking in some cases close to or more than 100 million people per attack. And it was remarkable to see over those 3.5 years when I would go back every time, they're not wanting to talk about healthcare taxes anymore. At the rubber chicken dinner in Sulphur Springs, Texas, the first thing people would come up to me and ask about is, hey, I want to talk about cybersecurity policy. So if there's a reason for optimism against this threat landscape, which is rapidly evolving, I think it's that there is an awakening of vigilance of the American people. This is not a peripheral issue. This is very central to their way of life.
So I'm glad to hear that there's not just reason for fear, but also some reason for reassurance. Thank you for that, Dan. David, your horror story?
Inject a less optimistic note. It is not about the people or the resources who are now focused, but it's really our approaches to risk management. And if I were going to cite to an example, I increasingly feel, and the people we speak to feel, that we're sort of at the pre-9/11 moment or the pre-financial crisis moment, where many people are looking and seeing things and watching with increasing concern, but the leadership is yet to be there, the centralized leadership. And I will say as a citizen, but I'll also, sort of draw upon my prior federal government experience as well as all the people here, that something more is owed to the American people. And the people we speak to who have been both in the government and are now in the private sector and may have gone back to the government echoed a recurring theme, which is we've yet to have ownership of this issue, and we've yet to have leadership of this issue, and we've yet to have fully transparent reporting. And it's episodic to episodic. And I'd like to recall, I guess, a overarching theme of the 9/11 Commission, but also the findings from the financial crisis, which is those events were less a failure of intelligence and of information than of imagination, coordination, and connecting the dots in advance. And I think that increasingly, and we've talked about tariff wars, we're seeing cyber being used as part of that conflict. The way I would start to approach this, and this is the benefit, I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I've had the benefit of working with some of the smartest people, including to my right and to my left, is that what happens here for citizens as well as institutions is because cyber is about technology, it becomes an overly complex puzzle, and people feel there's a language and a body of science that they cannot possibly grasp. And accordingly, I have found it easier, with the benefit of my colleagues, to think about this in analog terms. Namely, the crimes that we are witnessing are of biblical proportion. They are theft and fraud and espionage and various means of sabotage and extortion and blackmail. The actors are precisely the same people who have always meant us harm: criminals and organized crime groups and terrorists and various hostile states and state-sponsored groups. And the only thing that has really changed is that our portals, by scaling and acceleration, have changed through technology. And we continue, as Gus was saying, to implement and implement and implement without giving sufficient thought to the security that is needed. So there's no real cost-benefit analysis around all the things we're introducing into our marketplace, et cetera. And if we can begin to think of these things, I think, in analog terms and have a honest and frank disclosure with our citizens and between citizens, calls to action for our leaders, I think we'll be far better off. And I'll just close my opening remarks with the President noted that without borders, there is no country. And I'd like to suggest without digital borders, there is no national security or protection for our national economy. She'll turn it on.
Yeah. Tim?
Is it on? Thank you. We didn't plan this, but I think the outlook gets worse and worse and worse as we go down the line. Because I'm one of the most optimistic people you can probably meet. But I've heard a couple of different things. I want people to be scared. I want the government to be scared. I want the private sector to be scared, and I want our people to be scared, because I don't think we're scared enough. And scared, I don't mean fearful. I mean scared into taking some action the way David has just laid it out. Because I think that it is one of the biggest problems we face today, and I think it's bigger than the counterterrorism threat, the counterintelligence threat. This is what's happening is undermining our democracy in many, many different ways and in many different threat vectors. Daniel mentioned that we're getting a little more vigilant, and we're slowly getting more vigilant. That's the problem. Is this works at network speed, at code speed, and we're working at human speed to solve this problem. And you wanted a story. I can give you a story to where most of us have probably been victims of credit card theft, and you really don't feel the pain, and the public doesn't feel the pain. But in 2008, I'm sitting at my desk in the FBI. I'm the number 3 in the FBI, and I'm attacked by a state sponsor in the building on my unclassified network. If that doesn't cause you to be scared and take action, not only in your organization, but give you a greater outlook on how big the problem was and is, and that was 10 years ago, so you can understand the scope of it today. And we were fighting this problem. The FBI didn't even stand up a cyber division until 2003, 2 years after 9/11. So you can see how far behind the power curve we are in government, in the private sector, and educating our people that this is one of the most significant problems this country's faced in the history of this country. And we need to move to action, just like David said. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tim.
So yeah, I'm with Tim here. I think it gets worse and worse. I mean, if I had to pick a particular incident or really series of incidents to focus on and to really become the rallying cry for the challenges we face, it's the Russian attack on our election in 2016. Because when you talk about cyber adversaries, Russia is at the top of the list, a notorious list that includes Iran, China, and North Korea, but Russia is at the top of that list in terms of its sophistication. Russia has made information conflict a critical and central pillar of its national security strategy. You read anything that they put out, even in the public open source, this is part of their strategy. And cyber is not a siloed aspect. Like we think about cyber as something different from everything else. Cyber is a means of carrying out their geopolitical strategy. And what did they learn from 2016? They learned it worked. It worked because they were able to sow discord through their disinformation, and they were able to access some of the critical components of our election infrastructure. So there's every reason to expect that in 2018 and 2020, they will repeat what they did in 2016 with even more fervor and more effort. And on the flip side, the question is, what have we done? How seriously have we taken that threat? What has Congress done? What has the administration done? What have companies done to defend ourselves better? What pain did we inflict on Russia for the attack on our election? How do we even think about an attack on the fundamental pillar of our democracy when it's carried out by a nation state? How do we think about that from a doctrinal standpoint? So when I think about all of the cyber landscape and the threats we face and all of the ones that my colleagues talked about, which are all very serious, I come back to the Russian impact on our democracy and the lack of really impotent response that we've seen from the government in the last 2 years.
Thank you, Matt. And I think all of you did a great job in sort of laying out the landscape, the state of the digital union, and I'd love to sort of drill down a little deeper into some of these issues. And coming back to you, Gus, I was wondering, when we've spoken in the past, you've referred to cyber haves and have-nots. How in your view, how do they affect the nature of cyber risk?
Yeah, so I think we've reached a really critical juncture here in the cyber realm. We have this new digital divide, and I call it the cyber haves and the have-nots, and other people have spoken about a cyber poverty line. But what has begun to occur is that the wealthier, well-financed organizations who are large enough and have sufficient resources are actually pretty darn good at protecting themselves, and they make the investments necessary to do so. But they're all competing in this landscape with this critical shortage of cyber personnel that's driving cost up, continuous investment in technology, things like that. The problem we have in cyber as a nation and as a globe is the fact that we are all digitally interconnected, right? So if you look at Target with their HVAC vendor, right, they didn't get into Target directly, they get into Target through their HVAC vendor, right? And you see this pattern repeated over and over and over again. And the problem is that the HVAC vendor or any other small, less well-resourced organization doesn't have the wherewithal to protect themselves to the same level as the other organizations do. And when we have this massively interconnected world like we have and are moving into today, right, we have got to think of an approach that now can lift all boats. And that's something that I actually think is something that might be ripe for some form of legislative engagement or legislative action or something on those lines here. I'll give you an example. Right, back many years ago, they did the Rural Electrification Administration, where when it was too expensive to provide electricity or then phone service or whatever out to rural areas of the United States for people who were less well, off, right? The cost they felt was too high. The government stepped in and provided a program that actually incentivized the delivery of these services out to these other things. Can we think of a model in the case of cyber where we can find a way to lift all the, take all the mom and pops and all the small companies that we do business with? I mean, DLA alone just business with something like 60,000 different small mom and pops, right? Each one of these potentially puts us at risk from a national security perspective or something along those lines just from a DLA engagement alone as a classic thing here. Can we think of a way to enable us to do this, act together, and then and drive ourselves forward? Because it's going to take us finding a way to solve that problem. That is the only way we're going to be able to actually lift the cyber posture of the nation as a whole across the board.
Mukul, could I just maybe build on an important point Gus is making, and this is something that Tim, Matt, and I have spoken about. Let's go back to the founding of this nation, when Ben Franklin noticed there were no books, essentially, here for shared knowledge, and founded a library. Yep. And similarly observed the need to fight fires because of the contagion threat, and organized the fire department, as well as insurance around various mortgages, et cetera. And it's somewhat called coincidental or ironic that we're sitting here today, but a similar type of spirit and leadership is needed around this. Yeah. And this should not be about people robbing Peter to pay Paul, having more resources than others, and maybe, particularly because of the folks on my right, as well as Daniel, we can even wonder why it is cyber has escaped traditional criminal enforcement paradigms, traditional security. If there were people breaking into our businesses and homes, there would be a 9/11 to call. There would be demands for an organized response. It has yet to occur.
Yeah, so just real quickly, what cyber is an every man for themselves problem. Right. And that is one of the key issues around this have and have not. Every company, every business has to do cyber for themselves across the board. And remember, we have a cyber division in FBI, right? We've begun to approach this, but really I think have more of a what is the classic movie view of the Wild West before law arrived, right? Where everybody's having to defend themselves and do all these things independently, as opposed to trying to find a way to act together as a nation and solve that problem. So,
I would like to pick up on the point that Tim made earlier. And I think, David, you're exactly right. That and Gus, as you said, there is a need to lift all boats. Going to Tim's point, why is public policy so slow? Because it seems to me that that's what needs to happen in order to do some of the things that are being discussed here. Since you brought that point up, could you shed some light on it? And what should be done to speed it up?
Well, part of what we're doing today, right? It's the education. I don't think people have taken it as serious as they should have, and will in the future, because it's devastating to us. I mean, we mentioned some of the attacks, but we haven't even got into some of the more serious attacks where destruction of property. You think of Sony, you think of Sands, you think of Saudi Aramco, where you have state sponsors going in and making computers bricks and servers bricks, and can imagine that happening on Wall Street and on the exchanges. And look, this is all public information. We've had cyber attacks in those institutions, right? So what's it going to change to, really get people serious about it and change public policy? Maybe it takes one of those major events. It seems that we need one of those in this country to make that change. What we're advocating is let's get ahead of it. David mentioned a pre-9/11 commission, a Manhattan Project. It's been written about at the Wharton School, and a number of co-authors on these articles. So I just think it really is a call to action to get out in front of it. And I would say it's not only just the government, when we talk about the Hill or legislation, whether it's state or federal, but it's also agencies themselves. We can't get policy out. I'm sure Daniel will echo that. I echoed it from a governor. I'm sure everybody up here. And agencies aren't quick enough to move. Again, I get back to its net speed, and we're moving at policy speed and debate speed, and companies as well. It's hard to get out of the way of and really enable the business and protect the business at the same time, and getting it through legal and privacy and PII and all the things, and HIPAA and all the things you have to worry about in this realm. But we have to move faster. That is the call.
I'd love to come back to Daniel, but before that, Matt, I wonder if, given your experience, are there any lessons from the world of counterterrorism that could be relevant in dealing with cyber? What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting in this conversation so far. There's been a couple of references to 9/11, and that is sort of it's a real touch point, obviously, for our country in terms of an attack on our country, and then also how we responded in the last 17 years to the fight against al-Qaeda and terrorist groups. And I do think if you look at what we did in the past decade and a half to take on that fight, there are some real lessons that we can apply to cyber. There's some critical differences that make cybersecurity harder, and I'll mention the main difference, and that is that much of what we need to do in cybersecurity is in the private sector. 98% of the critical infrastructure in this country is in the hands of the private sector. So the government has a smaller role. But there are a couple of lessons that we can learn. One is that it's a team effort. We learned that the hard way around 9/11 when we weren't, as a government, well coordinated in sharing information. We need to do better to share information and work private sector with the public sector, with the government, more effectively in cyber. We need to address the lack of people, the lack of expertise. We did that with expertise around counterterrorism, but there are hundreds of thousands of unfilled cybersecurity jobs in this country. And then third, we need to harden our defenses. We've hardened our terrorism defenses. We've all experienced what it's like to get on an airplane. That's the ways in which we've hardened the aviation sector from a terrorist attack, but we haven't done enough to harden our networks and our data. There's lots of great technologies, but it's a bigger problem than just technology. It's a people and then the process and policies behind those processes that need to be modified to harden our defenses to make the cost too high for the payoff to carry out these cyber attacks. So I do think you can look at the analogy of terrorism and learn a lot and apply those lessons to cybersecurity to improve our posture.
Daniel, to pick up on the point that Matt just raised, could you tell us a little bit about what does the legislative landscape look like in dealing with cyber risk? What kind of legislative framework is required? If you can share some recent developments on the Hill regarding cyber, that would be fantastic.
Yep, and I think to Matt's point, everyone would like cyber legislation to move at the speed of relevancy, not at the speed of administrative procedure and all that. But I think one of the first things you have to do when dissecting the landscape of cyber policy is the banner of cybersecurity policy has become so broad that you need to actually take the nuanced time to look at the lanes underneath of it. And so protecting networks and hardening networks is different from Facebook, Cambridge Analytica privacy-related policy. Yet that often gets jumbled all under the banner of, oh, we need to lead on cyber and be better on cyber. And I think if you just look at the recent election issues that we've had, Russia scanning state voter registration databases and hacking into political parties is very distinct from promoting content on Facebook. All played into the role of the election, but they are very distinct. And so I think as a starting point, when you look at what's going on the Hill right now, where we've gone from having one cyber hearing a month to sometimes 6 or 7 a week, where almost every authorizing and appropriating committee now wants to find a way to engage in cyber, that really understanding and making sure that we're engaging with a nuanced view of what those lanes are will ensure that the legislation that comes out is smarter. In terms of the most significant piece of legislation that has happened in the last few years that we're implementing and still conducting oversight over, it's certainly the Cybersecurity Act, which was passed in the omnibus in late 2015, which really provided liability protections and codified a lot of the information sharing structures between the private sector and the public sector, and the role of the NCIC at DHS and the role of ISALs and ISACs to kind of be hubs and mechanisms to ensure that information is being shared. And so that happened in late 2015. There's been a lot of oversight of it, and there's obviously a lot of interest to see that things are being implemented well there. From the Department of Homeland Security's perspective right now, there's some low-hanging fruit we obviously would like to get signed into law, and one of those is CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act, which at the top level would change the name of NPPD, the National Protection Programs Directorate, to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It would elevate the authorities of NPPD to be an operational agency component of DHS. And as the lead civilian hub for cyber information sharing and with the lead task of protecting the civilian.gov networks, it really makes sense to have a name that says what you do. And so I think that right there is indicative of the opportunity, but also the challenges we face. A name change has been hard. And we're hopeful with our Undersecretary's confirmation that we will get that enacted sooner rather than later.
I was hoping that we would have a few more questions on the panel, and one of the thoughts I had was to have every panelist ask one question of anyone else on the panel. Is to take one more leaf out of Adam Grant's recommendations on how to do interesting panels. So I will cede my role of moderator for a bit and ask if one of you would like to ask a question of one of the other panelists. Who wants to go first?
I'll lead.
Okay, great. Thanks, David.
Sacrificial lamb. Let me go back, and I know things are very tough in Washington. But even the fact that, as Daniel said, even getting the name right is tough. And I would quote General Hayden, who made the observation that it will take a crisis and then we will over-respond. And I guess my difficulty as a citizen is trying to understand why we cannot treat this as we do traditional crimes. With the actors being identified as they have been, they are traditionally the people, the adversaries of law-abiding citizens and institutions. Why we can't unpack the crimes for what they are. Again, they go back to biblical times, whether it's fraud or espionage or some form of sabotage or blackmail. We've yet, as the panelists have acknowledged, we've yet to come up with the models of specific and general deterrence, of reporting and response, and of, we'll call it shared community protection. things that will lift all boats. I come from New York. There was a time in the 80s when New York was, very, it was very chaotic, to put it mildly. It took certain measures to sort of reduce the crime rates, and we over-responded in many respects, as we know. But I just don't get the sense, and I think as a citizen, it is incumbent upon the government, and it's incumbent upon citizens to work with the government to get to those points. And if we just think of this as something new and innovative, and if we think of this in technological terms, I just don't think we get there. And I think we have to reduce this. And to the point about weaponization, it is interesting to Matt's comments about 9/11. Again, you have actors who can spend very little money, scale their resources very effectively, have an asymmetrical destructive impact while using our own technology, back then it were airplanes, against us. And that's what's occurring right now. And if we continue to apply complexity and all sorts of it's about technology, I don't think we get there. And so my question to the panel is it going to take a crisis, or can we begin to apply what has worked in the past to deter enemies of the country, criminals, organized crime groups, in these activities, and begin to have a unified response that will protect all? And I will just note, simply because Wharton had a very comprehensive discussion about tariffs and taxes earlier, this is the greatest tax on the national economy, bar none. And it's the greatest, I'll call it, tariff on our economy, bar none.
Anyone wants to answer the question?
I agree. I didn't come up through the law enforcement ranks, so I'm going to, turn it over to Tim and everybody. But yeah, I think you stated very, very well, which is that the approaches we have been taking to this, which have been mainly focused on technological and other things like that, clearly have not been working, right? So it's we as I mentioned earlier, the classic signs of insanity, the same thing over and over again, expecting different outcomes. We've got to get to a mechanism that allows us to engage and do these things. And I think we see happening in government, you see these things progressing through, right? So we are in the middle of very large discussions about how you actually fold in cyber and cyber deterrence into the levers of power and power projection and whatnot that the national security apparatus actually has to be able to operate with, right? But how those get structured and how they get put into play is what's currently at top of mind of folks, right? I mean, this is a lot of what I think is going on in the discussion with DHS, and the Defense Appropriations Act talks about how they were supposed to engage differently and things like that. So I think you're seeing a lot of interest and action today. I wonder how we could maybe more effectively focus that action to drive outcomes faster, because we clearly can't just talk about it. We've got to actually get to some sets of outcomes and conclusions.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and although we can continue this conversation endlessly, I think there are some excellent questions from the audience, and I'd like to try and tackle as many of them as we can. So if it's okay with you, I'll just dive right in and get to the questions from the audience. I think the first question is for Daniel. When Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, appeared in front of congressional committees, members did not appear knowledgeable about cyber issues. What is being done to educate members on technical cyber issues?
Thanks for that question. And I think it goes back to my earlier point that saying cybersecurity could really be like saying public policy. There's so much underneath there to unpack. And so that lane there, very much sort of privacy lane that's much different than, say, protecting the civilian.gov networks in terms of the responsibility there. In terms of good news, and having just worked for a member of Congress who spent a lot of time getting briefed on these issues, there is very good coordination and cooperation between the executive branch and between the legislative branch on things that happen underneath the surface. So the classified briefings they get, the briefings that the staffs get, the conversations that happen all the time. I think cyber is an issue, luckily, that in some lanes is still very bipartisan. And so all the time, the leadership at DHS, they're having conversations with relevant members of Congress who have issues on these, coming and doing briefs through their office. So like the mechanisms are there, the ability to share that information, to educate, to give tours of our NCIC floor and things like that, that is all there. I think it's just a reinforcement and redoubling of understanding the nuance of these issues. It's never going to be just as simple as introduce some bill that creates a grant program to help some people, pat yourself on the back, there's the bill. These are all going to be very complicated and interconnected issues going forward. And I do think that, again, I'm trying to give more of a glass half full perspective on this, just having been on the Hill for close to 4 years. But what I saw underneath the surface of the waters outside of the 90-second YouTube clips that people want from congressional hearings is a commitment to understand these issues. And so if there's a reason to be optimistic, when people want to learn and want to engage, that's the opportunity to affect change and get ahead of the curve that I think so many people on the panel here today have felt like that perhaps we're behind.
Next question.
Before, can I just add in there? I think
course.
I don't want to speak for David and everyone else on here, but I think, there's a number of people that'd be willing to help in that effort in education down here or anywhere that's needed too. And I think you get a lot of volunteers that experts in this space that would come in on a regular basis to help try to educate those that need to be educated. And if not, just ask your grandkids.
Thank you, Tim. That's really good to know. So the next question is, you've talked a lot about the volume and frequency of attacks. Can you describe and or quantify the actual losses? That's an interesting question. I've seen a lot of different estimates.
I mean, there's lots of different numbers, and Tim, you mentioned a couple of the reports, Verizon report. There's a number of different documents out there that try to quantify the impact. And one number you see sometimes is the average cost of a breach around $5 million or whatever that number is, right? I think it's in that ballpark. But one of the broader concerns I would have is that those numbers are almost always, don't take into account all of the costs that from a cyber breach in terms of reputational impact for a company, extended liability that proceeds from a breach. I think we're consistently undervaluing the cost of the breaches that we're seeing, and the other thing is that there's different types of breaches. We've talked about those. There's some that involve the loss of data, but there's others that are increasingly common, and those are the ones that are destructive, that actually destroy data or destroy systems, and those are becoming more and more common.
If I can just chime in on the back of that. There are sets of numbers that are out there that you can go find. The Verizon report, as I mentioned earlier, has some numbers in that you can go get. What's really interesting is that the cost of cyber crime to the United States economy has been running about 0.7 or 0.8% of GDP for the last 3, maybe 4 years, pretty solid, okay? So somewhere in the, estimates in the $150 billion range in terms of those costs. What I find really fascinating is that inventory shrinkage, which is that wonderful euphemism for employee theft, shoplifting, and damage to inventory, runs twice the rate of the cost of cyber crime. And I just want you to sort of think about that, because we treat that as an imbued cost across the entirety of the framework of our retail environment, and when you pay an extra nickel a sweater when you're going to buy one, there's all these things. But we don't impute cyber in the same way, right? So cyber becomes this crisis mode of operations every time an event happens, as opposed to just figuring out a way to deal with these events in a more consistent and straightforward manner. And I think that may be going to how we have legal structures around dealing with those things around inventory shrinkage, and we don't have the effective legal structures around how to deal with a lot of the events that happen in the cyberspace. So.
The only thing I'll add is we always talk about cost around it, but what's the cost of undermining your democracy, stealing your intellectual property in the billions, literally billions in the DIB? So it is very hard. in the different breaches, there's a per record cost. And then if you get your servers destroyed and your hardware, there's another cost. But I think the cost is much bigger than that. It's our way of life here in the United States.
It's an interesting question. What is the current state of the cyber insurance market?
So
Nascent.
it is nascent, and the data, the loss data, is still evolving to have actual actuarial models. I'll also note from experience, and maybe these guys can comment further. I'm an analog thinker. Having clients who have called their insurance companies to report breaches, what I've found is that it is akin to, with some companies, it can be akin to when you have an automobile accident and the adjuster shows up and lowballs the damages or tries to get you to a repair shop where maybe not everything gets repaired as fully or with original parts. So very often insurance companies will have their own forensic experts who will come out. It's rarely the A-team, and they don't always get to the bottom of things. So let's just say it's evolving. People sleep better knowing they have insurance, but it is far from sort of the perfect net here.
Sure.
I think it's important as this cyber insurance market develops and matures, the goal, like any insurance market, is for it to incentivize a set of behavior that makes us all safer and more secure. And so if you look at a lot of the ways that current cyber insurance policies are constructed, especially for large utility companies or energy companies, they're insuring their asset against a whole host of potential events, a cyber risk being one of them, and that's built into the policy. But getting the actuarial base, so we get to a point where for the cyber insurance policy for, say, a small and medium-sized business, if none of your employees use two-step authentication for their accounts, it costs $500 a month. And if you have a way of certifying that they all do it, it costs only $150 a month. So actually getting that mechanism in there to incentivize behavior that gets us all safer. And I think that does come with a maturation of a better actuarial base of the threat data there.
That was also the Ben Franklin model for insurance against fire risk.
Most of the threats I have seen speak of external cyber security threats. What about internal threats of employee sabotage? How does one combat those?
Yeah, I think that's a good point because it's often overlooked in that we continually think of the external threat mostly when we think about the serious damage, the external threat by state sponsors. But also at the same time that's happening, adversaries are inserting physical attributes, individuals into organizations to, destruct and destroy and steal and manipulate data and intellectual property from within the organizations themselves. And then on top of that, we have regular employees for some reason and some tipping point, some trigger that they may have at their workplace, whether it be a government agency or the private sector, want to cause some harm to the organization. You see that regularly in the news. I think there's been some major ones that we've seen in the government. So it's often overlooked. But what I will tell you is that it's gaining a lot of steam, similar to the idea of cyber and the state-sponsored attacks, and us in the risk that face. But I think companies now are putting more insider threat and insider risk, or I would call them continuous evaluations. There's public companies out there that call them insider trust programs, where they're actually monitoring the behavior from within. What is someone doing on the network? What kind of anomalous activity is happening? And then also monitoring outside behavior that can be tipping points, right? Domestic violence, domestic abuse, those type of things that may cause them to take other actions within the organization that they're working in.
And just to add on to, I agree totally with what Tim said. And I think it's useful to think of this insider threat in terms of the two categories that Tim talked about. There's the most high profile, the purposeful insider who decides they're going to disclose some information. And that, you think Snowden, or you think of the recent revelations about the CIA employee. Those are, and there's company employees who do the same, purposeful disclosures, leaks of information. But the vast majority of insider threats are those that are accidental. The employee who doesn't understand not to plug a thumb drive into their computer that somebody gave them, or doesn't patch, or responds to a phishing email. It's the training and education you can do for your employees to prevent the insider threat that is presented by those who are just accidentally creating risk for your companies.
So just one more on that. In a slightly contrarian view, inside and outside, the line is actually blurring, right? Because of phish credentials and things like that. Right. It's often very difficult to know whether somebody inside went bad or they got their credentials phished because they did something dumb, and now somebody's in there masquerading as them. What I think is really critical for us to understand is that your adversary, no matter who it is, inside or outside, is after only two things. They're after data to steal it, to damage it, to destroy it, right, to change it, or they're after control, right, to implant something that allows them to take control of your systems and your networks at the time of their choosing. And those are the things that we have to design for. And if we design for them really well and we implement the techniques and capabilities we actually have in hand today as effectively as we can and should, you can actually mitigate the threat both from the outside and from the insiders simultaneously across the board.
I have one question for Gus. That is, Gus is proposing legislation to lift up everybody, including mom and pop businesses. But the government, CFTC, has just overruled net neutrality. How do you counter the lobby of tech to defend common folks?
Wow. I'll be honest. I don't see. Well, maybe I'm dense. I don't see quite the relationship between net neutrality and net. My personal view on net neutrality is, well, if you read anything I say, so you know what I think about it. But I think the net should be absolutely neutral across the board, and what goes on. The issue of raising all boats, I don't think we ought to tie to specific things around things like net neutrality legislation. Things like that. I think what we want to be able to do when we think about trying to lift all boats and enhance the cybersecurity posture across the space ought to be independent of those types of things. The objective is to find a way to enable, I love the example, right, of the insurance that Daniel gave, which is, I'm going to pay $500 a month. If I'm not doing something right, I'm going to pay $100 a month to do it, right? Well, can we provide a service that provides this at a cost that ensures that I actually can only pay the $100 a month because I have a service that is shared across many, 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 many people. This is where managed services is going to come into play, into the fore in a huge way, I think, across the nation, so that now I actually provide those types of things, and I have somebody else who is really skilled and expert at it, and I'm leveraging the skills of the few to the advantage of the many, in the country and what's out there. Okay.
Mukul, can I just add to Gus's point, because what is needed, if you think about the simplicity that's been imbued into our technology products, that's why they sell, that's why people want them, and why they rely upon them. And the same approach has to be with security. I will tell you, New York City, under the auspices of the Chief Technology Officer and the leadership of the mayor, has implemented sort of a safer cyber city program whereby people who are logging on will know whether their devices are safe. And it's done seamlessly. There's no data protection. You download an app, and it helps guide you throughout. It's that type of thinking that is necessary. And compounding this, and this is something that Tim and I have written about, the notion that when you are attacked, somehow this crime is different. There's an underdisclosure problem also in the marketplace, because the victim gets blamed for something that he or she should have done. So again, an analog with certain sexual assault crimes and how we used to treat victims, there is a need to allow people to come out of the woodwork to share their experiences and what has worked, what has not. But I would argue that you have to make it seamless and you have to make it simple for companies and people of all sizes, including startups, to be able to be safe.
So we have 2 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is to pose this one question to everyone to answer in about 45 seconds. What is your top suggestion for something that the government should do to secure our next election from cyber risk? Just rapid fire, just 45 seconds. Your top suggestion to protect and secure the next election from cyber risk.
I'll start. There's most likely will be, if there's not already, a task force involving many other agencies to work together in that, and I'm sure DHS plays a major role, Daniel, in that. But I think it's looking at the whole of the picture. You know, Daniel broke it up into, and so did Matt when we talked about the Russian influence campaign on the elections, but at the same time you have cyber breaches of companies that are running the elections in each state, and so we need a holistic view, and we need it now. Again, I don't think, and I don't have insight, so I don't know if we're moving fast enough, but my general instincts would tell me we're not moving fast enough because it's not far away. That holistic view on what's happening with intrusions into anything that touches in the supply chain, our electoral process, and at the same time what's happening with the influence, which also plays a major role in our next election.
Minutes?
I would say, picking up right where Tim was, a national task force that requires a certain level of cybersecurity for every system or product that is part of the election infrastructure at the state and federal level. And that needs to be a national level task force, which doesn't exist now.
David?
The increase and acceleration of communication, collaboration, and cooperation with the state and locals that has happened since 2016, when I think everyone admits collectively we were caught flat-footed, that's got to continue, it's got to continue, and it's got to keep accelerating. There is progress there. The EI ISAC, the Election Infrastructure ISAC, which has been stood up since the 2016 election, now has 49 of 50 U.S. states plugged into it and over 800 entities total. So that's good progress. Obviously, more work to be done, but I think you had Missouri Attorney General Jay Ashcroft on the Hill this week saying since 2016, his relationship with federal authorities in terms of collaborating has been, I think his quote was, quote, night and day. So got to keep that up. None of those are data points to fully pat ourselves on the back on and rest on our laurels. Keep all those channels going as we chug towards November.
There were lots of great questions we had that we were unfortunately unable to get to, but I'm hoping that...
Can I just weigh in, because I can't resist? Can we go back to the old machines with the crank, the lever, and the X's? Okay.
That's exactly what I was going to say. For 2018, paper ballots.
It all used to work.
Okay. Paper ballots. 2020.
Right.
We could consider.
Why not? And Mukul, I just have to give one editorial comment because we're in the nation's capital, the center of collaboration and bipartisanship, is that if you look to the left and the right, I've been benefited, including by Wharton, in seeing publicly minded citizens, some of whom have been in government, gone to the private sector, who very, very much want to help. And I think the key to this, and thank you, Ken, for sponsoring this, is to leverage all sides here, because there is no shortage of people who truly care and are willing to help, and it's now time to organize that effort. So thank you for sponsoring.
We've run out of time, but I just wanted to invite everyone to thank our panel for a great discussion.
So we're going to take about a 15-minute break. We'll be back to overheads and numbers. We're going to be talking now, moving from data infrastructure to physical infrastructure, big hot topic, and we'll be back at 2:15. continue on. And whereas the last panel focused a lot on the data infrastructure, we're now going to shift and talk about the physical infrastructure. And John Huntley will begin. He was previously with the Fiscal Studies Unit at the Congressional Budget Office. He's working with us at the Penn Wharton budget model. As I mentioned earlier today, whenever somebody from the Penn Wharton budget model presents, we always want a discussant. And that discussant today will be Mike Parker, who is a partner at the ENY U.S. Infrastructure. In fact, he's the U.S. Infrastructure Advisory Leader and oversees ENY's Infrastructure Advisors, which is an SEC-registered municipal advisor. Has many distinguished industry awards. He's done a lot of stuff on transportation, higher education, telecom. He was previously a co-owner of a company, Jeffrey Parker & Associates, that was then purchased by ENY 2012. And so, John, why don't you take it away?
Very good. Thank you very much, Kent. I'm going to move us now from the fast-moving and dynamic world of cybersecurity to the fast-moving and dynamic world of public infrastructure. Okay. So the Penn Wharton budget model has done a lot of analysis recently on the infrastructure, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about how it works. And basically, when we're doing our analysis, we're trying to answer 4 questions. So we start out by asking ourselves, well, if the federal government gives some aid to state and local governments to build infrastructure, how does that impact the state and local government's budget? To do that, we turn to studies on real-world data of federal aid as well as state and local government budgets to figure out how the state and local governments respond. Okay. Once we know that, once we know how much infrastructure we built, we actually want to know how productive it is. How much more GDP do we get out of this infrastructure? And again, we turn to a very, very large literature of studies on real-world data about output and infrastructure investments. Once we have these 2 things answered, then we can turn to our model to get some insights about 2 additional questions. First of all, we want to know how infrastructure projects are going to affect the federal budget. And then secondly, we'd like to know how it affects the economy, because that's really what we're interested in. Okay. So I'd like to start talking a little bit about how state and local budgets are affected by federal aid. One of the ways that the federal government can provide aid to state and local governments is basically to directly give it to them. And they often get this aid in the form of block grants or matching grants with caps. Okay. So your block grant is just an amount of aid that's given directly to the states, and it's usually does not carry too many restrictions. So if the federal government gave New Jersey $10 billion to build roads, and they built roads, that would be a block grant. A matching grant with a cap or a limit, it doesn't look like a block grant, but it behaves very much like a block grant. So I'll just use as a quick example a build grant. So they may give money to a state, but the state has to provide some effort, some amount of effort. So for example, New Jersey might spend, for every $1 they spend on a road, the federal government may pitch in up to $4. However, these grants are typically limited. So in this particular example, the individual project is limited to about $25 million, and the state is limited to about $150. So there are definitely strong limits. Now, you're going to get new infrastructure built when you issue these grants. Some of the money will find its way into new infrastructure spending. But a more effective way of getting states and local governments to contribute their own money toward infrastructure spending is to develop programs of federal aid that lower the cost of infrastructure spending. And the best examples we have of that right now are tax credits and loan programs. So I'm going to use a quick example of TIFIA, because TIFIA I like because it offers the ability for state and local governments and organizations to borrow money at below market rates. They tend to be able to get the money from the federal government at a rate lower than they could acquire it at on the private market. And that makes building infrastructure cheaper. And state and local governments respond to these sorts of incentives. So how does this work? Let me just use a household finance example, because that's I like to relate everything to household finance. And imagine for a moment that you're going off to Wegmans, and you show up at the grocery store. I like Wegmans a lot. And somebody gives you a $10 gift card. You go out and you do your shopping, you go and get to the register, and what's the first thing you do? You're going to pull out that $10 gift card and pay for it. So you're using the gift card to pay for your groceries. But is your behavior really going to change? Are you going to save that extra $10? Probably. You might use it on going out, going out to eat, pay down some debt, something like that. By contrast, something that lowers the cost is going to change your behavior more. So if you showed up at Wegmans and they gave you a 50% discount card, all of a sudden your shopping experience is going to be very different. You're going to look at that $40 steak, that $40 a pound tenderloin, and think, wow, this is great. This is $20 now. I'm going to get this. The desserts at Wegmans are beautiful. They're even more beautiful at half the price. And you're going to want to spend more money, and when you get to the checkout line, your basket is going to be considerably different than if you didn't have that card. So the literature tells us, studies of real-world data tell us that state and local governments respond to the same incentives the same way. Maybe not quantitatively the same, but they do respond to these incentives. Recent Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler, for example, has written on this topic before. And what the studies say is that states, both of these types of programs, you're going to get new infrastructure investment. But if you want state and local governments to contribute more of their own money, you need to lower the cost for these guys. So let's take a little bit of a look here on how much. So let's talk about a couple of different mechanisms. This is just a few examples that we've evaluated over the last few months of types of federal aid and how they impact actual infrastructure being built. And so we turned the literature to develop our range of low, medium, and high. And we're going to start with the block grants and the matching grants with the caps. Those programs are a lot like the gift card you're getting at the grocery store. You're going to spend this money on infrastructure. The question is how much. And the literature has a pretty wide range, but in the middle of it, it's probably going to be about 50 cents. Our range could go from $0 to $1, and it can vary by project, but 50 cents is a good estimate. So what's happening? The federal government is giving $1 of infrastructure aid to a city or a community, and they're turning around, they'll spend that $1, but they're going to say, wow, I feel a little bit richer now. I'm going to take $1 out of my existing, 50 cents out of my existing infrastructure spending and put it towards some other priority. Policymakers ideally a policymaker, if they're giving out money, wants to get that number to be above $1. That's the goal is we're throwing some money in, now we want the states to contribute even more so we end up with great big grand projects. But that relies on being able to identify what projects would have been built and what projects would not have been built without the aid. And that's very difficult, and that's what the studies are telling us, is that historically policymakers have not been successful at that. In order to get people to invest more in public infrastructure, we need to give them an incentive, which leads me to the loan programs or the tax credits. The literature is telling us, the studies are telling us, that people are going to spend more if it gets cheaper. It seems to make sense, and that is reflected in our slightly higher range. There are a couple of additional types of federal aid. Well, this one isn't really federal aid, but this is direct spending. So sometimes, these infrastructure bills contain money for projects like the national parks or Amtrak. We call this direct spending, and there's not really any state analog to this. So money that gets spent on this is going to end up as, $1 that's spent on direct spending is going to end up being reflected in $1's worth of new infrastructure. Okay. And then one more example that I'd like to offer you. There are several beyond this, but some of the grants are targeted towards distressed communities. So when I'm talking about distressed communities, I mean places with high vacancy rates, they have high property tax delinquency rates, low economic activity, high joblessness. These areas have difficulty getting new money for infrastructure projects. They have a tough time raising additional revenues, and they have a tough time borrowing, at least at competitive rates. In this case, we think that possibly federal funding may stick a little bit more here. These guys they have infrastructure priorities that they need, but they just don't have the means to finance them. So if you give them money, we expect that they might put a little bit more into the infrastructure projects than they would otherwise. However, they can't really go above and beyond because, again, they have trouble raising taxes and borrowing money. So, again, we're capped up at the top of our range of about $1 for these types of grants and aid. Okay. So now that we have a way to actually figure out how much new infrastructure we're getting, we need to know how productive the infrastructure is. There is a very long literature, a lot of studies of real-world data on output and infrastructure investment, and there are a lot of different answers. It varies by project and it varies by approach. We looked to the middle of the range of answers that the real-world studies give us here, and we come up with an answer of about 10%. So if you invest in a bridge or something like that, it's going to pay you back, everything else being equal, about 10% per year. And these things last a long time. So we're talking about 10% year after year after year. By contrast, in our model, you can look at private capital, and the return is about 6%. So those are like computers and trucks and buildings, things that are privately owned return about 6% per year. So our public capital is going to be a little bit more productive than our private capital, which seems, again, it's in the middle of our range, and it seems like a sensible answer. Okay. So now that we have the tools, we'd like to talk about a couple infrastructure plans that we're evaluating. Earlier this year, the White House released its infrastructure plan, and I guess a month or 2 months later, the Senate Democrats issued their own plan. Okay, so the White House plan was about $200 billion, and most of it was allocated toward block grants, matching grants with caps, and there are some other loan programs and small subsidies in there as well. We used the procedure I've described earlier to sort of evaluate how much actual new total infrastructure will be built and come up with about $125 billion. That's our middle of our range. And that's what I'm going to use in the analysis going forward. Okay. The White House plan does not explicitly provide a method for financing this plan. However, they do emphasize that most of this aid will be directed toward projects that develop new sources of revenue. So in this case, we choose to model these as user fees. Think of them like tolls that you're going to pay when you're riding on a freeway that's been built. This is how we're going to pay for these things. And user fees have one advantage. They're more efficient or more effective at raising money than some other distortionary taxes. So user fees don't do things like affect your take-home pay or your returns to investment. And so they're not directly going to affect your choice or a household's choice of whether to work or save. So in that case, there are going to be fewer negative economic consequences from using user fees than there might be from using other types of taxation. By contrast, we have the Senate Democrat plan. It is much larger. It's about $1 trillion, and it's spread over a similar mix of programs, mostly matching grants with caps. There are some loan programs, subsidies, tax credits, and direct spending. Again, applying the previous methodology, we end up with about $630 billion of new infrastructure. Again, it's about a little more than 5 times the White House plan. Unlike the White House plan, the Senate Democrats do provide for revenues to finance their program. They call for about $1 trillion in additional in higher tax rates on both personal and corporate incomes. Okay, with that background, I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens and how our analysis works here. So let me start with the White House plan, which begins with about $125 billion of new infrastructure capital. Let's start on the left side, which is the left panel, which is the plan funded by user fees, and we have 2 different bars that we got. The blue bars are the 2032, so that's 15 years out, and then the orange bars are 25 years out. And you can see they're all very small. That's very deliberate, because we're going to compare this to the Senate Democrat plan. This is a small plan. Okay. So on the leftmost column here, we have GDP. You notice you can't see a whole lot. That's because GDP is not changing a whole lot. It goes up a tiny, tiny bit, but ultimately around to 0. 2 things are affecting GDP, and they're pulling it in opposite directions. First, we have public capital that's going up by 0.6% in 15 years from now. So when $125 billion in public capital is not enormous, I think as Mike is going to show in a little bit, our current total public capital stock is somewhere in the order of $10 trillion. I apologize if I just wrecked one of your main talking points there. But it's going to be even bigger in 2032. So $125 billion is not a huge increase in the capital stock. So we're talking about 0.6%. Offsetting that, on the other side, is a slight decrease in private capital from the general economic effects and the taxes here. So the negative private capital is pulling down GDP, and these two effects offset each other, and basically there's a very, very small positive effect in the end. The rest of the economy is effectively unchanged. Debt, well, the program is paying for itself with its user fees, so we don't get any more debt, and average wages and hours worked don't change at all either. The story is effectively the same in 2042. It's just that the public capital is even bigger, the economy is even bigger, so our investment is looking even a little bit smaller. Moreover, our investment is slowly beginning to depreciate out as these projects get a little bit older and a little bit less useful. As potholes start accumulating on these bridges, the traffic's not going to move as fast, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the net effect is pretty much the same. Okay. Now I'd like to highlight the right panel, which is the same plan, the same infrastructure plan, the same amount, except this time it's being financed with deficits. And it's not that they propose this, but I want to show you how deficits affect these plans. Again, we have the positive pull of public capital, which is exactly the same, but now we have a little bit, a significantly larger decrease in private capital. Private capital goes down 0.2% in 2032 and nearly 0.5% in 2042. Well, why is that? It's because debt is going up. We had to issue debt, and as Kent showed earlier and talked about earlier, debt is crowding out private capital. So in this case, and as time goes on, the effect is snowballing and crowding out more and more private capital. So the negative effect from private capital in our analysis is bigger now than the positive effect from public capital. And we end up with a drop in GDP of 0.1%. And even though it says 0.1% in 2042, that is a little bit larger. They both just round to the same place. So the lesson here is that user fees are a more effective way of generating GDP with an infrastructure plan than our higher deficits. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to the Senate Democrat plan. Now I'd like to turn to the Senate Democrat infrastructure plan. The first thing you notice about this is that it's much bigger. But ultimately, the story is very similar. So we have $630 billion worth of new infrastructure capital, which is a positive pull on GDP. And again, we have a loss in private capital, which is a negative pull in GDP. So in 2032, the effect on GDP roughly nets out. But by 2042, it's a little bit bigger. Well, why is that? When the Senate Democrats raise money for their plan, they're using these distortionary taxes. And although we assume that they're only 10 years long, so they've since expired by the time you're looking at this graph, their effects live on. Over those 10 years, their higher personal taxes and higher corporate taxes drive down savings and work effort just a little bit. And that is reflected in lower GDP, which leads to lower tax revenues. So in the end, their revenues are not paying for the full cost of the infrastructure plan, and they're piling up a little bit of debt. And you can see how that happens in the fourth pair of bars there. Debt in 2032 is about a percentage point higher than it would be in a world without a plan. And that has a drag on private capital. The one other thing I'd like to note is that the private capital going down also tends to lower average wages. So it's going to make people paid a little bit less. You take away my computer, I'm not going to be able to run these simulations or slides, and that's going to make me a little bit less useful. You know, the jury's still out on that, but that's what most of us think. But that's going to lower my pay, and that's going to be reflected economy-wide as people become less productive. Okay. Now, on the right panel, I'm showing the same plan but financed with higher deficits. Again, the Senate Democrats did not propose this, but we just wanted to highlight the difference between these two financing methods. So this is the same story as we had under the White House infrastructure plan. The infrastructure is pulling positively, but now we have an enormous amount of debt, which is about 4% higher in 2032. And that is really dragging down our economy. So in 2032, we've lost more than 1% of private capital, and by 2042, we're nearly down to 2.5% of private capital. This is a very big negative effect on GDP. It's reflected in significant losses in both GDP and in average wages. So the important thing to know is even though we're using distortionary taxes to finance, the Senate Democrats are using distortionary taxes to finance their infrastructure plan, financing with deficits is still much worse, and that's exactly what I think Kent showed earlier in his analysis of the tax plans. So with those lessons, I'd like to conclude by talking about what makes for an effective infrastructure plan. And I think there are two key features here that will make for an effective infrastructure plan generally. The first is that we need to lower the cost of infrastructure investment for states, local governments, and in some cases private entities. We need programs that lower the cost, and the ones we have now are like tax credits and loan programs. We want them to invest more. The second thing is we want to use the most effective tax that we can, and we like user fees. If those aren't available, the next most effective tax are distortionary taxes. The choice that causes the largest drop in GDP is using deficits to finance these, because these are always going to crowd out private capital, and in almost all circumstances will crowd out the gains you get, the higher productivity gains you get from public infrastructure. And just to make this point, we considered a $500 billion hypothetical plan that adhered to these principles. So firstly, it's funded by user fees. And then secondly, it's just loan programs and tax credits, things that lower the cost of public infrastructure. We find that in sum, over 15 years, that we have an increase in GDP of about 1.5%. So that's the total effect over all 15 years. And that increases to nearly 3% 25 years from now. So adhering to these two principles is one of the more important components to designing an effective infrastructure plan that has lasting positive effects on GDP. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Great. Well, thank you all for the chance to share some thoughts with you, and to Kent and to the Wharton team and Kimberly for setting this up, and for John for really setting the stage. It's very gratifying for me to be able to talk to you today, in part as a Wharton alum, but also as a practitioner in this field, but also as a user of infrastructure. And one of the fun parts about working in this field is that it's very tangible. And when we achieve success on the project, we can point to it. And in fact, at the same time, all of us are sort of infrastructure experts. And so, I grew up in D.C., actually watching the metro be built on Wisconsin Avenue, and then riding it out to National Airport and watching the planes take off as a fun activity for an 8-year-old. My son will be taking the Green Line in Philly to high school next year. And when I'm down on July 4th weekend in Nashville with my in-laws, they're going to be talking about traffic and investment. And these are folks who never talk about paying for any sort of public infrastructure, but it's going to be a big deal for them. And it continues to be. So, in a sense, the U.S. is not like many other countries, though. Sometimes people will ask me, and even in our firm, we'll be talking at a board level, when's the infrastructure spending going to start? But the U.S. actually has a tremendous lead, or it has had a tremendous lead, I should say, in infrastructure. And in fact, we're benefiting from the foresight and investment of earlier generations. There were public and private investments from the Transcontinental Railroad to the subway system to the National Highway System, water, electrical grid. This underpinned a period of remarkable growth and growth in productivity, as well as quality of life. But right now, many of our iconic facilities do require reinvestment, and in some cases, reimagining. And in newly growing cities like Nashville, there's a need for a first generation of infrastructure, or really a much more expanded generation. So this presents some challenges, but also opportunities. And part of what I'd like to talk to you about briefly now is sort of level setting where we are in the U.S., but then some of the questions that you might ask, including what is the effect on GDP, as you consider new infrastructure programs. So right now, you can see, and first of all, I know there's some folks obviously from CBO in the audience, so thank you for the data. We're passing it back to you, and know that there's those out there in the world who are consuming it. So as I said, maybe starting actually on the right side, if you look at the amount of construction being put in place in the U.S. infrastructure, and we've made some assumptions about what the definition of that is for office, for healthcare, for residential, for commercial. We took out the private sector, but for communication, we've left it in. And we're over $400 billion of new construction being put in place. At the same time, if we start looking at real spending using infrastructure-specific inflation indices, we've been in decline relative to, and we've been in decline in particular as operations and maintenance go up. And that's probably not surprising, right? If you don't maintain something well, it starts to need more operations and maintenance investment. And if you look back in time to that earlier dip, there was a time my grandparents on my dad's side were first-generation immigrants, and we were going out to Brooklyn to visit them. And it was a noteworthy story in our family when I asked my dad if we could wait for the next train on the New York City subway, because at the time, the one that had come had graffiti and was not in the best of shape. Of course, that was every train, and so we got on, and that was that. But now we're starting to experience that. And even here in Washington, D.C., you have the transit system that I was comparing the New York City one to, but that was conceived in the 50s. It was built over 40 years ago. We also, though, on the O&M side, it's an interesting management problem, too, because we should be able to improve our performance of how we manage and operate our infrastructure. So when we think about also the effects of infrastructure on the economy, sometimes sentiment is a useful indicator. Sometimes not everybody, just because you're leading a company, means that you actually have a sense of how macroeconomics works, and things can be counterintuitive, as John was just showing, I think, for many folks. But when we survey about 2,500 corporate executives twice a year, and we started asking them about infrastructure this time. And so the first question we asked was, will government spending impact your growth plans over the next 12 months? And 78% of global executives said yes, it was important or critical to their growth rate, about 64% of U.S. Interestingly, we also asked them what their expectations were for government infrastructure spending over the next 12 months. And you would think this is something pretty easy to have a clear sense on, given that infrastructure takes a while. So 75% of global executives felt that their government was going to increase infrastructure spending, about 59% of U.S. And maybe this is less surprising. It's not just that people have different policy views or different understandings of the world, but actually in the U.S., most of infrastructure, unlike in many other countries, is owned at the local level. And most spending occurs at the local level, and decisions to spend. And so we're seeing it's not really even a red state or blue state thing. Los Angeles just incrementally increased the spending on infrastructure at LA Metro alone, just that transportation agency, by $100 billion. It's passed a new measure, which is their fourth measure, so it's incremental. At the same time, Georgia has done that, and so you have Metro Atlanta has a new $11 billion program. State of Tennessee, state of Pennsylvania, Virginia, numerous have taken different types of actions. But it might not be surprising that U.S. residents or executives in different parts of the country might feel that different things were happening. We talk about how states view spending and where the federal program fits within that. It's also important to see that we're in a different world, and it's a world of more devolution than historically. Federal funds are only about 28%, maybe less, depending on how we're counting private finance and public-private partnerships, of state infrastructure at this point. I should point out also that state bond proceeds, in a sense, aren't really funding, but if you're putting together a project to build tomorrow, they are a source of funds, but they do have to be paid back, and so they're quite different. So we're very different from other countries in that sense also, in that our states and localities do borrow, and they have the ability to do so, and often efficiently through the tax-exempt market. So as we start to turn to how we're going to reinvest in infrastructure or increase our spending, asking better questions, we think, is a great framework. And it's part of why I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and this event today, because I think we can argue about what the goals are, but we do want to make sure that we're creating programs that have that implementation and that have that result. So my background is more working directly with projects and with states and localities or private companies that are developing new projects. And so there also can be a gulf between the macro policy level and what happens on the ground. But at the same time, sometimes anecdotally, we miss the forest through the trees. So I would submit to you that the first three questions that anyone should ask about a program can be fairly straightforward. Will it lead to a net increase in domestic infrastructure investment? And I really wrote this without coordination with John, but that, there's the question that we need to ask if that's the intention. Will that new investment, if we have it, go to projects that are worthwhile? And then, assuming we've picked projects that are worthwhile, will they be completed and maintained, and will they perform the way that we expect them to? So, let me head back here for a second. So will the program lead to a net increase in domestic infrastructure investment? Changes in how we or who manages or funds infrastructure, even this discussion of should it be federal or should it be state and local, right? These can change incentives. We can have discussions about public-private partnerships. We can reallocate risks, and that can create powerful results. But it doesn't necessarily lead to greater or more worthwhile investment. It could be more productive or less. And so you could ask questions like, will that program attract and reward or displace investment from states and cities? But also, can it be relied upon by CFOs who are managing their debt capacities? If they're planning for the infrastructure for the next 10 years, how will they view that program? Or are we overstating the benefit of a program, even a tax credit program, but it's complicated? Or is the juice worth the squeeze? Or will it just change who invests rather than how much, at least at the macro sense? Or will a program actually make an impact in the next 2 to 5 years? Infrastructure projects take a little while to develop and certainly to construct. So if we create a new program, the program set up in the time even just to choose a project could significantly impact the benefit of it. So poor investment decisions also, if we pick the wrong projects, will limit the benefits of the program. And not every project, even aligned to the right goal, will best meet its objectives if it's not a well-conceived project. And then, in fairness, not everyone really shares the same sense of objectives either. So meanwhile, we are increasingly able to understand our infrastructure as part of a wider system and environment community. So when we're thinking about new programs, we could ask, is there a transparent approach to allocating spending? If decision-making is required, is it at the appropriate level of government? I don't think anyone who's had practical experience in the field would ever suggest that these are things that should be taken off in a corner, that there's not a political dimension to them. But if funding is going to be awarded, and if that's a federal role, will it be predictable? And will it be a complex process to get it? Is there a way that the program can be designed to readily identify or to bring forward credible projects, and can they then be certain that they will get it? If a state goes out and passes a new gas tax or raises it, do they have any assurance that the federal partner will be there? And does the program, is it cutting across silos sufficiently, given how we now understand our systems as networks? Likewise, does it encourage the performance of a network? In Philadelphia, we have we have the bones, tremendous bones of the infrastructure system. Some of it built in the 18th, 19th century or 20th century. If that system operated 30% more efficiently, if the trains ran 30% more quickly, more often, that could have a huge ROI. Can we capture that, or are we just thinking about expansion? And so, lastly, we build these projects. How do we know that they're going to be completed on time and on budget? Will public confidence be undermined if they're not? Will they be inefficient? Were they a good investment at one price but not at another? And in fact, the confidence to keep investing is probably undermined if the initial projects are poorly planned or delivered. So having, and when we see in private industry, the reality can be that depending on how we contract, there can be limited incentives or even disincentives for the parties involved to estimate well, to control costs and schedule, or even to design the project to perform optimally over its life. So how will a new program address those kinds of questions? And are there ways to assure results and long-term accountability without burdensome oversight, especially if the federal role is a much smaller percentage of a project than it was historically? So I think we want to allow some time for questions, and I think I would just close by saying that from our perspective, a renewed commitment to funding infrastructure does create an opportunity to conceive new programs and to think again about these types of issues. And demonstrating that we can think through them carefully might in fact be crucial to earning the confidence needed to secure investment, or at least continued investment. And so I think lastly, there's a bigger picture to consider. As we renew our infrastructure, do we aspire just to rebuild? Are new technologies or demographic changes or the potential for new business models and a better understanding of our needs, can that too shift what we build and how we build it? So thank you, and we look forward to the discussion.
All right. We got a lot of questions. As one of those topics that generates a lot of interest for us. And so I'm going to be going a little rapid fire. So a couple of you said you also want to use the microphones as well. Feel free to do that. Let me go through a couple of these cards first, and then I'll go to the microphones. So the first one, John, is clearly directed to you for your presentation, and that is, so the high rate of return of public capital, to the 10% that you mentioned, much higher than the return to the private capital, which was 6%. And so the question is asking is if there are, is this due to the fact that there's a lower stock of public capital? There's diminishing returns and therefore high marginal productivity because of the lower stock of public capital relative to private capital. And so if so, if there are these diminishing marginal returns, how much would you expect significant increases in public investment to reduce the marginal rate on public capital? So you could almost think about one of the Republican or the Democrat plan, for example, how much did that 10% come down as you boost up public capital?
I think that's a fantastic question. So yes, there's a lot of news and information about how our public capital is sort of lagging behind. So I think there is some dimension on which the stock of public capital is a little bit lower, which makes the productivity of it, the productivity of an additional dollar a little bit higher. I also like to think of it as a comparison to private capital. You know, if you're a business and you see a business opportunity there that pays a little bit more than the marginal product of capital, you're getting a little better return, you're going to jump on it. Mm-hmm. But the public sector doesn't really work that fast. It takes a very long time for these things to build. They can be in the pipeline for a very long time. So that may mean that there's some effective projects out there that have not yet been realized.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second part of this question is, do I expect it to go down? Yes, absolutely. But I think there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the projects themselves. So some things are naturally more worthwhile than others. And furthermore, even the Senate Democrat plan at $600 billion is only 6% of the entire U.S. capital stock. That's not an enormous amount. And by the time they're finished building all of that, the U.S. public capital stock would be bigger anyway. So it's going to be an even smaller amount. So yes, it would go down. I don't know exactly by how much, but you know, I'm just trying to keep it in perspective and note that it's a pretty small plan.
All right, and related to that, and this is maybe also from Michael, is talking about you just mentioned heterogeneous kind of return to different types of projects. That 10% is kind of an average, but there's a lot of heterogeneity around that. So the question is, you know, in fact, if the benefit to cost ratio very significant between, for example, road widenings, and that may only increase travel or decrease, I think they meant to write, travel time without additional safety, or you know, various other benefits versus projects that will improve, for example, jobs or improve safety. There are these different returns, and of course, the model incorporates the fact that there you have this high marginal productivity of public capital, and still you get the results that you get. But there's a lot of heterogeneity around that. So, so you talked a lot about how to finance, and then the mechanism that what type of taxes you use versus versus distorting taxes, and then of course how to incentivize the states to kick in more. But this is really a question that's more focused on project selection. So, Michael, I think, you know, talking about that heterogeneity, what would you say are kind of the big ROI, you know, projects? Are they more on repairs, or are they more on, what are the big ROI type things?
So I do think that infrastructure is local, and the needs in different places are commensurately local. And there are different types of social returns as well as purely economic returns. I realize in a room of economists, we can find different ways of quantifying or thinking about that. So I think there are some programs, there are some projects that are just taking care of what we have, and preventative maintenance actually, which is something we haven't been doing, can be very high ROI in a long-term sense. But in terms of some specific projects, we can start to see that I think really, in my mind, the question of why we want the states and locals to spend versus federal is not fully answered by this sort of macro analysis. And so we can talk about what would be an incentive for the state or local to spend. To me, for example, if there's state and local participation in a project, it's a good signal at a certain level, or there's private participation in the project, that the project has merit to somebody and otherwise, and it's less of a likely to be a bridge to nowhere. So I think that's sort of a different and more interesting point to me in some cases than when it comes to finding ways to get to project selection.
In fact, you and I have talked in the past about the irony about that, in the sense that if, from the federal government's perspective, the state and local has more interest in a particular project, probably indicative that it's a higher ROI project. At the same time, it's also probably indicative they would have been spending money on that project as well. And so then the offsets things become.
But I think recognizing
Yeah.
we're having discussions of budget model,
Yeah.
in some ways I'm thinking about more as a national policy.
Sure.
And so if we need the project needs to get done.
Sure.
And so whether or not they would have done it or someone else, the question is, as a country, do we do
Yeah.
it? And so that idea of finding efficient ways to have project selection and to resolving what also you cannot ignore that there is a political set of trade-offs that
Sure.
have to happen to get a project of scale to
Let me go to the microphone. If you could identify yourself and your question. Yep. Yep.
Assuming it's financed by borrowing, and you have GDP falling, which seems to imply that there's greater than 100% crowding out. That is, you get. We're going to borrow $200 billion. We're going to build infrastructure. The $200 billion then is not available to the private sector. So the private sector can't build private sector capital. It doesn't seem like GDP would fall.
Yes, that is a very technical question. So there are a couple of issues in there. So what I showed you up on the chart there is just 2 years really. It's 2032 and 2042. So the government is spending money on this in some ways faster than the infrastructure is coming online. And so we're actually running up a little bit of debt earlier, and then that's having a snowball effect. So we're actually crowding out even additional, Kent showed earlier that we're actually crowding out additional public capital in addition to the $200 billion worth that we're borrowing. Because there are negative economic effects that are not being offset by the positive infrastructure spending nearly as fast. The second thing is that the public infrastructure, even though it may have a high productivity, remember, we've lost some of this. Some of the states have taken their infrastructure budget and they've allocated it to other state spending, for example. And so we're not getting the full blast of, we're not getting 10% on that whole $200 billion.
Okay, I get the second. I'm not sure I understand the first point, but I get I get the second point. So we're not getting the full $100 billion. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not getting the benefit of $200 billion worth of public infrastructure. We're getting the benefit of $125 billion.
The model must have private investment must be very sensitive to interest rates in the model.
I'm going to defer to Kent to the exact elasticity of public investment with respect to interest rates, but yes, it is sensitive to interest rates.
Private investment.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it is. I mean, and we use the standard elasticity of savings from the literature from that. But there's two things. One is that offset that you're creating debt of $200 billion, but you're not getting a total spend of $200 billion. You're getting the offset. But the second one is that this is partly the timing issue. There's a time to build function in there. It takes a while to ramp up the infrastructure. And then as a result of that, you're accumulating, it's not just $200 billion of debt, it's actually, by the time it gets ramped up, it's $200 billion of increased primary debt, but then there's interest that's debt service that snowballs on top of that. So by the time the public infrastructure is actually ramped up, it's not just $200 billion of debt, it's $200 billion of debt plus debt service. So it's really those two things that are happening.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So with the infrastructure, another question that from the card is, it says, for infrastructure projects funded with private sector participation, what kind of firms or entities have been the main private sector participants? I think this is probably best for Mike.
Sure. So there's a spectrum, because sometimes when we talk about infrastructure projects to begin with, we may be thinking about new construction projects. And so that is a category. There's also significant trends of private capital investing in either privately owned or publicly owned infrastructure that's existent. And so within the spectrum of public-private partnerships, we see a mix of vertically integrated construction firms, as well as specialty private equity shops, and increasingly some public pension funds starting to be willing to fund into those. However, a lot of the sort of more direct investors we see looking more for established projects that have revenue streams that are proven, that don't have construction risk associated with them, and that have a cash flow that's immediate. And so there's also some movement where there's a secondary market, and there's some specialists who work on the development of projects, and then others who work long term. We are seeing that type of vertically integrated investment from contractors, from now domestic contractors. Historically, about 15 years ago, there was a much greater preponderance of international as well. We should also mention, though, that certain types of infrastructure are by country as to whether or not that overall category of infrastructure is public or private. So utility investment, which is a very significant type of infrastructure, or oil and gas midstream infrastructure, or others, or telecom in the U.S. are undertaken clearly through a mix of corporate strategic investors and private equity.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's a lot of the utilities, the telecom. How much hedge fund action have we seen in this space? Or do you see a lot of public-private partnerships? You see some outside the U.S., but what about inside the United States?
So I guess sort of depends on your definition of hedge fund, which itself can encompass a lot. But I think we would see more pure private equity, and then some pension funds in some countries that have the governance to undertake direct investment. Yeah. We're talking about on the equity side. Of course, infrastructure lends itself to debt, because typically it's a much more, to the degree it has a revenue stream associated with it, it's often a longer, more predictable one. And so the pool of debt investors, in fact, of course, much U.S. infrastructure is financed with tax-exempt debt. And so I think there's a broad spectrum there. The true hedge fund activity we've seen has actually been more around distressed assets and coming in, repositioning them, and then selling out.
Yeah, and it relates to your debt a point. I grabbed the question here. I think this is probably more for John. It says, you emphasize how negative deficit financing is, but if we run federal deficits in order to develop infrastructure, cannot that actually be good, or worse in general than tax increases to pay for infrastructure?
Well, I think that today, right now, when we're doing these analysis based on today's economic conditions, and I think that's the lesson that we're learning, is that using debt to finance these things, it doesn't pay for themselves. They don't pay for themselves. Is that we need to finance a way, even if it may be distortionary. Using distortionary taxes is a more efficient way to implement these programs than using deficit financing.
Yeah, and I think there's a distinction between economics, the macro effects, versus kind of generational equity. In some sense, one can make the argument for deficits that, hey, future generations are ones benefiting from it. They should help pay for it through deficits. But that's different than macro effects, where, for ceteris paribus, for amount of infrastructure, how do you actually want to get that?
Yeah, John, I think also I would say, noting some of our clients in state and local world and in government, as they've seen your analysis, some of the questions they would have around this also, well, are fuel taxes user fees in your view? Are they, or is that general revenue? And many cases when we do talk about state and local governments committing, it can be sticky, and it can be sticky at the federal level too, because these can be lockbox revenue streams. They're not all general spending.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I think those are some questions that people have had.
Sure, and let me go to the microphone over here. And if you could state your name or where.
Bernardo Weaver, I work at World Bank in Washington, D.C. on PPPs and project finance.
Nice.
So I have two questions, actually, and for John, but Mike can also talk about them. So first, like, I don't understand how the return on private investment infrastructure can be lower than the public investment, because in general, the private sector will be more savvy in looking for projects with higher IRRs, right? And the projects with a higher social return to be pursued by the government. That would be the first. And the second, something that you mentioned that, like, in order to produce economic growth, it would be ideal to invest in projects that had more revenues from the project itself, like toll roads, the example you gave, right? So usually those projects, they're projects that address wealthier clientele, right? Like wealthier sections of the country that can pay higher tolls, because usually in a toll road, you can like support OPEX, but it would be harder to support CapEx, right? Unless you're in a very expensive, wealthy area of the country. And the role of the government in these instances is to develop social welfare, right, and to reduce poverty. And so how could we tackle those projects if they rely much more on increasing taxes or issuing more debt, which you showed as problematic according to the two government plans that you showed from the Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Okay, well, to answer your first question, I just want to clarify when that it's public infrastructure. I actually mean all infrastructure projects in here are 10%. So it's when I said that 6% is private capital, I meant that's private, like completely private. There's no public component of that.
Like a factory.
So I'm sorry. Like a factory or a computer or something like that. So yes, I agree with you on point number one. Absolutely. I mean, in the second one, you know, this is a broad level analysis of the plans that were proposed by the Senate Democrats and by the White House. I mean, there's an enormous amount of flexibility in designing the particular types of user fees and the or even distortionary taxes that may be used to finance these programs that can accomplish any number of the goals that you had listed. So, you know, you shouldn't feel restricted. You know, I've listed a hypothetical program funded with user fees. I mean, there's a whole broad range of options there that we have not analyzed, and we'd be happy to analyze individually as those plans come out. But you should never feel restricted to just those options that we listed above there.
And I think this is, you know, maybe one of the reasons that I wouldn't. This is pure speculation, but that public projects can have a higher return if properly chosen. Is sometimes there can be, you know, a private activity can extract rent, or even a toll road, if priced to maximize revenue, you know, could actually end up degrading the quality of service, say, on free roads that are nearby, or causing other externalities. And so if the government occasionally is in a position to determine sort of the way to get the best sort of bang for the buck out of that infrastructure, it's not always by extracting the most charge for that particular piece of infrastructure.
Right. And I just want to piggyback off something Mike said there. It's, you know, if they're charging very high tolls on the highway, in some ways that defeats the purpose of putting up public infrastructure. I mean, if they're revenue maximizing, then the toll road is going to be underused, and it's going to have lower productivity than it would as if you were tolling to maximize usage. And so that's always a consideration too. User fees have to be designed effectively to accomplish the goals that the policymaker is trying to push.
Yeah, and you also keep in mind we're talking about equilibrium outcomes here, and I know that gets a little jargony, but it's exactly your first point. Private sector guys are picking off the high ROI projects, and so what gets left is, you know, the 6% in equilibrium, whereas the public one, it's hard to, if that's subject to some type of public goods free riding problem in terms of private provision of a public good, those could actually be generating high ROI, and it's hard for the private sector to pick those off.
So
it has to be really quick, because I want to get through some other questions.
Just to finish that,
Yeah.
So then, but the conclusion states that, in order to invest in projects that are more socially relevant and that will have a smaller toll revenue, you end up more likely running into deficits or increasing taxation, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to think about the projects as a whole, I think. You know, all of your objectives and then tailor the particular tax plan to achieve whatever your objectives are.
All right, we have to, about 6 minutes left, so I want to run through these kind of rapid fire here. I feel like I'm on my Sirius XM. Oh, okay, I'll be right there.
I'm going to get to my question, so I'll sit down if you have.
What's that? All right. I will try to, I feel like I'm doing my Sirius XM radio show coming close to the hour, trying to get all these things in. Can you clarify this for John? The low, medium, high spending scenarios, you had the zero response for grants. I think that was on the low end. This person said that it seems low. Gramlich and Thaler estimated, closer to 1/3. I think that was one of the middle estimates. But at the same time, the tax credit response seems high. The DOT had a hard time giving away $1 billion in TIFA funds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the literature has a vast range of estimates. The low represents, a couple studies on the low, and the high represents a couple studies on the high. Granted, the loans and the tax credits are a bit thinner. It's difficult to figure out exactly what the elasticity is, but there's one particularly good paper that does show that there is a strong response to costs, and it's one of my favorite studies of real world, and it looks at water projects in California, and it was done by a Wharton professor, Bob Inman, and then it shows that state and local governments really do respond. There are loan programs and tax credit programs that are not structured in such a way to lower the cost. Maybe they're too small, or they may have other features that don't make them that don't end up being reflected in a lower price for the next marginal.
I think that's Hey, bottom line comes from. You can leave your mic on. Bottom line comes from the literature, but the results you are presenting were from the middle.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it really is important to see that there can be tax credit programs that people need to hire firms like us to go monetize the tax credits, and by the time you're done with the efficiency of the program, it's not necessarily an efficient program. And the same thing on the loan side. It can take a year or two to negotiate a loan.
Yeah.
The project's benefits are being delayed. And so you can see that some of these types of things that are self-liquidating, and I don't think that municipal debt is always the right answer, but the tax-exempt debt markets are efficient here as an example of where you've actually just lowered the cost.
Yeah. This question, why do you assume the Trump plan or the White House plan would be financed with user charges when it allows for any state and local, I assume, government, including new taxes or debt? I think it was basically saying states will have some flexibility in how to come up with their share of it.
Using the text of the document, they're emphasizing projects that are producing new types of revenues. Admittedly, they don't have to exclusively be user fees. They could be other things. We picked that because it seems sensible, and it was in line with historical example.
Yeah, and you also did the deficit finance one as well. And that was really a focus on the federal share of it there. But so if you could only pass projects with user fees, then socially important projects in low-income areas will never be made. Hence, it will continue to sacrifice the poor, increase the income gap. So how do you build, poor, kind of end infrastructure? And that, I think, Mike, you go first with that, and then John.
So I'm also always cognizant of being the sort of practitioner who's working with communities to get projects done, and I think we want to make sure that we're having this dialogue where you see don't miss the forest through the trees. But I think clearly there is an important role for projects, and the point of them can be, in fact, to maximize usage of them. And that can be true in a number of dimensions, whether it's infrastructure or otherwise, and the outcomes for public health or for safety or overall economic development can be very significant. And so I think clearly there does need to be a balance. And I think that kind of question around, is a fuel tax a user fee, or how are we thinking about user fees? Is it really always about a toll or about the maximum choice? But I think clearly sales taxes also at the state and local level are very common. And frankly, the InfraGrant program from the administration really is showing that some of the projects they're positioning or awarding grants to are ones that are implementing new taxes or new sales taxes. So I think we are seeing that.
Yeah. And what you see in the analysis that John presented too is that in those types of programs, that's where you don't get a big state offset because they wouldn't have been spending money on that. So you get this trade-off where you may use a more inefficient thing like a distorting tax. On the other hand, the states aren't able to offset a lot of that. So by how much do the credit programs and loan guarantees in your proposal lower state, and just be clear, it wasn't a proposal, I think you're doing analysis, but how much do credit programs and loan guarantees in the last example that you did, lower state and local borrowing costs relative to tax-exempt bonds?
This might actually be a better question for Mike.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the project, and it actually depends on the implementation of the program. So just as an example, worked on a project that applied for a TIFIA loan. We brought 2 credits to the TIFIA office, 2 deal structures. Both were rated BBB-. One of them had a $50 million NPV higher cost to the state than the other. The TIFIA program, the way it chose the higher one, and that there were some reasons from a policy standpoint that they wanted to go there. But I think it would not have had a $50 million increase in the credit subsidy cost from a federal budget side. So I think there can be a wide spread. One of the things I'd also talk about is who's spending the money. And a program like TIFIA can also equalize the cost of capital if you have some distortion where we actually are subsidizing tax-exempt debt, but for a certain project, the private sector taking the risk of something happening or guaranteeing its performance would jeopardize the tax exemption. TIFIA, in some cases, is just leveling the playing field between these two, but it might allow for a more efficient project delivery or to pay for a project, and this doesn't get to the macro point, but some projects don't happen because you don't have the cash on that day to do it. And so a lot of states having that flexibility to pay over time is important. But the cost between tax exempt and taxable fluctuates, and the benefit for TIFIA is actually that there's no change in the cost for a lower credit rating. So you can actually finance more risk without paying up for it, and that can be hundreds of basis points. If it's purely just a perfect, AAA muni versus a taxable federal, start getting closer.
So how difficult is it to predict problems, if I'm reading this correctly? The way I'm interpreting this question is a lot of times infrastructure is to deal with natural disasters. And so in particular, you might want to incorporate the fact that there could be these shocks because we don't have good, drainage systems and, things like that. How do maybe think about from ENY's perspective or your perspective in the practice, how do you think about that when you're talking with state and local governments, federal governments? How do you quantify kind of it's not just the expected outcome that matters, it's really the variance.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of nascent effort around resilient infrastructure and figuring out what does that even mean, and is it infrastructure, the whole network, and this is actually the discussion on cyber and the one we're having now start to converge. What does it mean to have a resilient network? And that's a little bit different than resiliency infrastructure like a seawall that you build that's only purposes for that. And so there is a significant body of activity going on to encourage greater thinking when we're building something for it to function in multiple ways and to be more resilient. At the same time, I think I mentioned that a good question to ask about new programs is it allowing us to think across silos? Is it allowing us to not just replace in kind, but to consider the impacts in these different scenarios? And I think there's a lot of effort as we struggle to find financing for infrastructure to think about insurance premiums and can we invest in a way that we capture a lowering of insurance premiums is very hard to do. At some point, there needs to be federal policy.
And finally, and I'll also direct this one to you, Mike, as well. In particular, it says governments appear to underspend on maintenance and repair in particular. Yeah, I mean, one reason why I think we even have such a high ROI in general in the model is partly because of maintenance and repair often has very high ROI when averaged in. So is this, in your experience, Mike, is this true that cool new projects often get funded more than just boring, maintenance and repair, even though that might actually have very high ROI? And what do you think is kind of the reason behind that, if that's true?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Anecdotally, I think it's true in many cases. The federal program actually is a good example of that incentive. The federal program tends to support new capital investment, not operations and maintenance. I think from a voter policy standpoint also, it's a lot less tangible. It's also a lot less, it can be more difficult to hold people responsible for actually making the repairs. But this is an area, I think, where business management and analytics actually offer a lot of opportunities, too, for us to get better data about the state of our infrastructure and to make better capital allocation decisions between operations and maintenance and replacement. Yeah. But I think part of that is the funding programs can be predicated specifically on one type of use. Yeah. And a lot of what we do is color of money and how do you actually unlock funds that are not necessarily fungible.
Yeah, and I think it's an important question because it empirically does seem maintenance often has a very high ROI, and yet it doesn't get the glamour, and the federal backs up. Excellent. We ran a few minutes over. I do want to keep on pace, so we're going to take maybe a 10-minute break here, and then we're going to move on to our next panel, which is going to be on some cutting-edge tools, very cool stuff on how to use machine learning to do look at regulatory overlap, and then as well as what was blockchain, which is becoming hotter in state and local governments. What can it do and not do? But in the meantime, let me please join me in thanking John and Michael. Thanks very much. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll ring the chime in just a few minutes here, and we'll try to get you out here.
welcome you to our final session of the day, where we're going to talk about machine learning and regulation and blockchain and the government. So first, I'd like to introduce Jitinder Kohli. He's the Managing Director of the Government and Public Sector Strategy Practice in Deloitte Consulting. He's a globally recognized specialist who spent years working in the British government, which he'll talk more about later. And I'd also like to introduce Matthew Gracie, and he's the Senior Manager of Strategy and Analytics at Deloitte. And Matt is in a practice that supports civilian, defense, national security, health sector agencies, and they gain insight from unstructured data, such as regulations, to better serve their mission. And he has 30 years of experience in financial services and consulting. And Jitinder and Matthew are going to talk about machine learning to create a regulatory overlap map. Then I'd like to introduce to you Kevin Werbach. Kevin is the Associate Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School. His work focuses on the intersection of business, policy, and emerging technologies. He served in the Obama administration, as well as the Clinton administration, the FCC, the Department of Commerce, and he founded the Supernova Group. He teaches a mass open online course, or MOOC, with over 350 enrollments. Sorry about that. And he's going to talk about using blockchain to solve government problems. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jitinder and Matthew.
Wonderful, thank you. So here we are at the end of a Friday afternoon, and we're going to talk a bit about the future and how technology can really help policymakers. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, my name is Jitinder Kohli. I work for Deloitte Consulting based here in Washington, D.C., but as you will tell from the accent, certainly grew up in another country, worked in the British government for most of my career. And before we talk about technology in the future, I'm going to do a little history. So between 2005 and 2009, I served in the British government as the person responsible for regulatory control. The equivalent job in the United States is the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the White House, the OIRA role. So I served in that role in the British government. It was actually a career role. We don't have very many politicals in our government, so some differences in our countries. And in that period, we were going through, I worked for a Labour government, and our government had an absolute commitment to finding ways to reduce the cost of regulation whilst maintaining protections, and a commitment to getting those two things to happen at the same time. So we launched a pretty serious initiative to look for ways to reduce costs, and over a 5-year period, we did hundreds and hundreds of initiatives around agencies in government, and as a result of that, took out about $5 billion worth of cost for business, which, to get to a US number, you might multiply that by about 10. It was about 0.6% of UK GDP at that point in time. But we did it in a very manual way. Like, we did it by, counting all the, getting all the regulations, looking at them individually, and it's a very human way that we did that. I've been in the US for about 10 years, spent 3 years at the Center for American Progress as a senior fellow, now work at Deloitte, and I came across some of my colleagues who understand computers 1,000 times better than I ever will, and said, well, actually, maybe we don't need to do this in a manual way. Maybe you could do it in a very different way. So I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's going to talk about the possibilities.
Thank you, Jitinder, very much. And so this is the Technology Gets Fun section of our day. And I realized this morning that I think I only have one thing in common with Steve Ballmer, and that is we also ingest public data and analyze it and make it available completely objectively. And that's really what we're going to show you today. I think that's where Steve and I end. So what we want to show you is a thing called the Regulatory Explorer tool. But just to sort of set the scene for you, right now you could go on your phone, on your computer, and look up the ECFR, so the Federal Code of Regulation. and you'll see how it's presented. And there's a lot of information there. If you're looking at regulation and you know what you're looking for, you can find that information. And for today's demonstration, what we're going to do is I've decided that we all like the outdoors and we're all keen to go outdoors because we've been here all day. And for most of us, like me, you'll probably like animals, so we're going to go with fisheries and wildlife for our presentation here this afternoon. And if I knew what I was looking for in fisheries and wildlife, I would know that it was Title 50. And if I was looking for particular issues around endangered species, I'd also know it was Volume 2, and it was Section 17.XX would be the section I was looking for. And of course I would know that because, well, we would all know that. But the information is definitely there. But using machine learning and advanced technology, we can get to this data more simply. And quite frankly, some of the techniques that we're applying here are similar to the ones that you saw this morning that Steve was showing us. So the Regulatory Explorer tool is simply that. It's ingested the code of federal regulation. We also ingest code from various states and other countries as well. And you log on to the system and you choose the data which you're looking for. We're going to look at the corpus of the United States for this afternoon. There's 217 sections of code. And here we go. Here we are in the discovery view. And I've chosen, as I said before, the Department of Interior. And already using, again, the tool and the machine learning, what we've been able to find is that nearly 80% of the Department of Interior's code has actually never been edited. You can actually see over here all the various sub-agencies which could be important to you, and we'll look at those in a minute, and you can actually see when those codes were actually created. So there's some information interesting here. The last time they were edited, the average time. So the average time since they were created was nearly 28, on average was 28 years ago. So let's drill down this in a little bit further, and we can have a look here at fisheries and wildlife. Interestingly, fisheries and wildlife code generally is a little bit newer, and actually there's been some significant updating in the last 5 years, which is interesting information which we can click on, and of course we could go and find that particular code if that's the mode that we were in. We can also, again using machine learning, we can actually cluster the various topics. So what the machine has done, it has read all the material, all the code, and said, hey, here are the various topics that look similar. If we look at this particular chart, the higher up the chart we go, the older the cluster, and the further to the right, the more similar the cluster is. We're going to have a look at this one just right here, which I've highlighted, and you can see it actually is bringing back all the code. There's actually, I think, 19 different sections of the code in there that the machine learning is saying is quite similar, and I can actually now scroll through those. Once I find the one that I'm interested in, I can actually dig a little bit further. And so here we go. By magic, we've just found Title 50, Section 17.22, and in here, and it's actually telling us about the section. You can actually read all of that, and also have a look at other sections that are very similar to it. Again, the key to understanding this technology is in the name. It's Regulatory Explorer. It's not regulatory, it's solved all the problems, or it's done all the work for you. What it's doing, as Jatinder was saying, it is doing a lot of the manual work up front. It is making the connections. It's getting machine learning to make the connections so that I can apply my time, my high value time, in analysing and understanding. So things like similarity analysis is guiding me through this process. It's guiding me and helping me try to understand what type of regulation might be similar, which might give me opportunities to look at editing, to look at potential conflicts in the various sections which may exist. The other section here, which is also quite neat, is actually now using a neural network, we've actually been able to understand the citations that are referenced in each particular section of regulation. So this is our target regulation, this one in orange here, And these sections here are the ones that it's cited but are older than it. The ones here in green, for those of you who can see, are the ones that are cited by that section but are newer than it. So effectively what we've done, we've sort of created the ancestry.com of those particular sections. Really important, because if I decide to make a change here, I can now see the impact and implications of that change across those sections that are similar. And of course, in a couple of clicks, the technology has done this for us. I'm going to move on because there's another view. There's another way I can get at this. I can actually look at the entire corpus of the Federal Code of Regulation, and I can actually ask it to look for, using keyword search, I can actually look for, in this case, endangered species, and ask it to bring back any agency regulation that might be related to that. No surprising, the Department of Interior and the Department of Commerce are showing up as the top two, and it might also, particularly if for those who read yesterday's announcement from the administration, it might come as no surprise that Fisheries and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Service are actually quite prominent in this as well. We'll move forward because I can then look at these two departments side by side, the Interior and Commerce, and I can then understand what their sections, their particular sections are, but again, I can also look for different search terms, in this case endangered, and see where the clusters are. So if I was at that agency or either of those agencies, I've now got perhaps the mandate to look at where regulation is the same or similar, or I want to look for opportunities for efficiency, this tool is actually starting to bring that together. So now I've got all in this particular instance, all the clusters of regulation across these two departments relative to endangered. And if I just move here, I can then click on those and start actually bringing back the actual sections themselves in this comparison view. So quite simply, what we've done here with this tool is been able to do a lot of the manual work. Quite frankly, the human brain's ability to understand that this section over here relates to that section over there in 217 sections is quite frankly impossible. This is why this technology was created, and this is why it exists. So we commend this to you from the standpoint of understanding how we can get into regulation in a much more efficient way and then start applying our own subject matter expertise faster to the problems that we're trying to solve in this space. And with that, I'll hand back to Jatinder. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. So what does that all mean for policymakers, and what can policymakers do? So what does that mean for policymakers, and what can policymakers do to use technology like this? And I'd say that if you're a policymaker and you're sitting in an agency, or if you're sitting on the Hill and you're looking for ways to deconflict regulation, you're looking for ways to eliminate duplicatory regulation or eliminate burdens that may be unnecessary and don't provide protection, this would allow you to do that much, 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 much faster than the old methods that we were deploying in the UK. And the methods we deployed in the UK weren't just deployed in the UK, they were also deployed by a number of other nations around the world. The Netherlands, Denmark come to mind, and a number of other countries. We're working on that all at the same time. Canada, Australia are countries that are right now working on regulatory simplification. So a couple of lessons from those countries that I wanted to share. One of them was that in the UK, certainly, we placed a dual emphasis on protections at the same time as reducing burden. And what that meant is we were able to build a lasting coalition committed to eliminating burdens where they were unnecessary. So, for example, all the work we were doing in the UK, we were doing collectively with trade unions and consumer groups, and we were getting their buy-in for the work that we were doing. So that's one thing to think about in the United States as the US kind of embarks on this journey. Secondly, I'd say another thing that we learned from the UK is that when government claims savings in terms of we've saved business this much money, then actually people are are reasonable and rightly questioning those numbers. And people want validation that those numbers are true. And in the UK, we certainly found that we had to set up an apparatus to allow us to do that validation. So that's another area where, as the US embarks on the journey to do this kind of work, it may want to think about whether that kind of apparatus is worth building and how to do that. And the third area I'd say is a number of countries around the world, including the United States, have actually got a tradition whenever you bring in a new regulatory idea of trying to assess the benefits and costs of that new regulatory idea. That's an incredibly important tradition. It's a tradition that means you only bring in regulations when the benefits justify the costs, and you have to stop and think about what those benefits are and what those costs are. And yet one thing the US has done that for longer than many nations around the world. But one thing that I'd say is different about the United States and other countries is the US only does that for regulations, and it does not do that for legislation. And certainly sitting on the Hill today, that's something the US might want to think about. In a world where the European Parliament and the British Parliament both are able to provide estimates of likely costs and benefits for legislative proposals at the pre-regulatory stage, that's one of the things that the US doesn't do right now and may be worth thinking about. So I think there's a kind of twin focus between, using technology to help you find ways to do things better, and always thinking about that policy lens about how, as policymakers, we can really advance this world whilst maintaining protections. So I'll stop there and hand over to Kevin.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm here at the end of the day, I think, because as you all probably know by now, it's now a statutory requirement that every discussion about solutions to our nation and the world's problems has to have at least one wild-eyed blockchain enthusiast as part of it. So I'm going to try to give you a picture of why, even though blockchain and cryptocurrencies are, in fact, probably the most overhyped technology of our time, they are also the most significant fundamental advance in digital platforms since the internet. So I can just get the slides up. There we go. There we go. I worked at the FCC. I ran internet policy at the FCC back in the late 1990s when the internet and the dot-com boom was just taking off. And in many ways, the parallels are striking. This is a new infrastructure baseline technology that can lead to lots of benefits, also has lots of problems. Blockchain is now the source of a great deal of fraud, of illegal activity, and of regulatory arbitrage, but is also sparking innovation across the world in all sorts of different areas. So I'm going to talk with you briefly about just what blockchain is, to understand at a foundational level what the real innovation is here, and then explore some of the implications and some of the opportunities for the public sector, some of the areas where we're starting to see experiments and pilots going on. At bottom, blockchain is not about money. Even though this is the technology underlying Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and it's not fundamentally about destroying governments and replacing them with purely private, decentralized systems, even though it is a system that creates a new kind of decentralized infrastructure. Fundamentally, blockchain is about something deeper than all of that. It's about trust. It's about what I call in the book I have coming out later this year, a new architecture of trust. The basic idea of blockchain is that you can trust a system as a whole without necessarily trusting any individual actor. So blockchains are networks. A blockchain is a distributed ledger. A ledger is just a database. It's a record of transactions. And the idea is anyone on that network can have their own copy of information. They can have total control over their data, have their own copy, and yet be sure and actually confident based on mathematical structures of cryptography that every copy is the same. That even though there's no master copy, that even though there's no central intermediary, everyone has their own copy of the ledger, all those copies of the ledger are identical. So that's how Bitcoin works. Bitcoin is a ledger of transactions, and even though there is no central government or central bank in the middle, all the participants on our network are able to have confidence, to trust the values of Bitcoin and where the state of the Bitcoin is in that system at any given moment. Now, there are a family of different technologies that are used to do this. Part of what's challenging technically in describing this is there actually are a number of different approaches, but they all share this basic notion. Albert Wenger, who is a venture capitalist at Union Square Ventures, talks about it as being logically centralized but organizationally decentralized. There's just one ledger. There's literally just one record that everyone is working off of, yet that ledger is distributed. Everyone can maintain their own copy, even across different organizations and across different countries. And this seemingly basic abstract idea is what has led to all of the excitement and adoption around blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Numbers that you're probably familiar with, Bitcoin being worth north of $100 billion, cryptocurrencies in general on the order of $300 billion, companies issuing these cryptocurrency tokens as what are called initial coin offerings, raising significant amounts of capital from investors all around the world, and many companies all around the world trying to employ this technology in a wide range of applications. That's tremendously exciting, but as I've already said, it's incredibly early. This is not a mature technology. There's great uncertainty. There are all sorts of problems, even basic technical problems that need to be worked out, and there are all sorts of non-valuable applications, people using this, for example, to commit fraud or using this capability to engage in money laundering and illegal transactions, and all sorts of regulatory uncertainties. Those are the things actually that I work on as a legal scholar at Wharton. Despite all of that, these are indications that we are early, not indications that this technology is fundamentally flawed or is fundamentally fraudulent or a Ponzi scheme at the heart. The reason is that blockchain has two huge basic applications, two basic value propositions. There is virtually nothing you can do with a blockchain that in theory you can't do with some other kind of traditional centralized database. However, there are large swaths of activity where no database will actually get deployed or will actually be successful because of basic trust problems. Comes back to what I talked about involving trust. And there really are two aspects of this. The first is trust minimization. In transactions, trust is a cost, right? If we didn't have trust in any kind of transaction, then we wouldn't transact. You wouldn't know that the other party would follow through. So trust is something that requires investment. It is a cost to make that transaction happen. And the idea is minimizing trust can reduce those costs and lead to more efficiencies. So there is a community that is behind some of the cryptocurrencies, that was early on behind Bitcoin, that is focused on taking governments out of monetary policy. But we don't need to distrust government and the state to see the value of minimizing trust. Any intermediary that is trusted becomes powerful and becomes a source of dependency. So take the Equifax hack. Obviously, part of the issue was the fact that Equifax got hacked and those 150 million people's records were stolen. But the fact was that that centralized intermediary, the credit bureau, had all of that data to begin with and was responsible for having to keep it secure. That's a trusted entity. So if we could design systems that would achieve the benefits, the point of Equifax and credit bureaus is not to have credit bureaus, it's to have a mechanism so that a distributed world of actors, companies and individuals can engage in loan transactions with some sense of what people's creditworthiness is. But that could be done without the central trusted intermediaries. It would be much more secure and be much more efficient. Anytime there is a central intermediary, it's a kind of monopoly. It tends to warp transactions for its own benefit. So there are all sorts of applications where we want to minimize trust, but there's another side as well. Sometimes trust is too limited. Anytime transactions cross organizational boundaries, trust becomes a problem. The gap in trust actually becomes a problem. Any organization can trust what happens within its four walls. But what if you do a transaction with another company? Well, typically, each side's not going to trust the other. They're going to have to maintain their own copy of the data, Again, one transaction, but 2 copies, or if it's a more complex chain, many more copies, and then synchronize them, reconcile them back and forth after the fact. That leads to delays, duplication, and errors. So you can think about, for example, supply chains, where goods and services are flowing all around the world between dozens and dozens of different organizations. The problem is the participants in that supply chain don't trust each other. They transact with one another. They'll all say, well, here's my application programming interface. You can connect into my database. But they're not willing to share the data with each other. One of the companies that did some of the early experimentation in investing in this blockchain approach is Walmart. They started with food safety. And again, Walmart is incredibly good at this. They're one of the best companies in the world in supply chain management. They said, well, how long would it take us to figure out if someone got sick buying something at Walmart, what farm grew that produce? 6.5 days, how long it would take them to figure out what farm it came from. The idea is if you can put that on a shared ledger, this one distributed platform that everyone has access to becomes much more efficient. In Walmart's case, they got the 6.5 days down to about 2.2 seconds, having it on a blockchain ledger. The other potential is everything is on one shared ledger, makes it possible to use as a platform and build what are called smart contracts, automated software applications on top of that ledger, and it makes auditability much easier. And in fact, auditability can be embedded in the processes itself. Because again, everyone is seeing the same ledger, so an audit is not something that has to come in by a third party forensically. The transactional data can be readily available directly on the blockchain itself, including to regulators. And what this has led to, roughly corresponding to those 2 categories, are 2 broad approaches. And again, there are different technical mechanisms underpinning this, which I don't have time to get into. But one class of systems are crypto-economic systems that use a cryptocurrency, a token like Bitcoin, as an incentive structure. These are the outputs of the system, but they're also the inputs. Bitcoin depends on Bitcoin to incentivize miners who are investing the resources to secure and validate transactions on the network. So the tokens actually become an incentive for behavior. That's one category of applications. The other category are what are called permission systems. If you know who's on the network, if you know who all the parties are, you don't need all the overhead of that mining and validation process. You can create a shared environment. No one's in control, still decentralized, but much more efficiently use that shared ledger. So let me talk about some of the applications of this, in particular for government. The reality is we're at a time when trust in government is at an all-time low. And so systems that minimize trust have tremendous potential. And we're at a time when government resources are incredibly constrained. And these blockchain-based solutions tend to be open source. They involve shared infrastructure and shared software. They tend to be incredibly secure systems, again, because they decentralize out this process of security and create an alignment of incentives to secure the network. And they're designed around an information security and cryptography paradigm that puts security at the core. And again, they allow for this integral accountability in the system itself. And there are many reasons why governments want to do this, including the fact that the reality is governments want to show that they are tech savvy. They want to attract capital and attract innovation and attract startups to their localities. But also governments want to be a platform. This notion that the government infrastructure can be a ledger layer at the bottom and then software functionality runs on top of it is very powerful. So let me very quickly run through a few examples and then I'll wrap up. Much of what governments do is about record keeping. Canonical official systems for records. These can be put on blockchains, making them more secure and more accessible. So Cook County in Illinois, the area around Chicago, has run an experiment putting land title registration on a blockchain, making it immutably secure. Once information is recorded on the blockchain, no one has the power to change that information. And again, potentially being the foundation for these smart contracts. So when there are liens on properties or other needs to add additional information, that can be layered on top in the same system. On the right is the former governor of Delaware announcing something called the Delaware Blockchain Initiative. Delaware changed its corporate law and built a system for corporate share issuance. Basically, when you buy a stock in a company, you don't actually own that stock. It's technically actually owned by an intermediary called the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. because if you actually own that stock, the system would grind to a halt because you'd have to trade the physical stock certificates back and forth each time. So there's an intermediary, but again, the intermediary has to be trusted, and the intermediary can't keep up with all of the transactions. So Delaware's created this platform for the share issuance of companies to actually happen on the blockchain. So then a company can actually see its cap table, all of its investors in real time. Second category is voting, where there's two big interests leading to lots of experimentation. One is security, obviously huge issues around election security, and the second one is access. So West Virginia just did a trial recently for their recent primary, where they did this for service members deployed overseas. If someone's on an aircraft carrier, it's hard to get them an absentee ballot to vote in the primary. So they had a vendor create a blockchain-based system that you could access with a mobile device and use it to securely cast a vote that will be recorded on the blockchain. So this potentially uses this immutable security of the blockchain as well as the native digital accessibility. This one, though, is one where honestly most information security and election security experts are extremely concerned about. Because the question is, where's the real challenge? Is the problem of information security in elections the core record, or is it all the things around the edges? And the blockchain may be perfectly secure, but if there's malware on your mobile phone that you're using to cast a ballot, so you push the button for the Republican and the vote gets recorded as the Democrat, blockchain at the core doesn't necessarily solve that problem. So this is one of the examples where there's early interesting experimentation going on, but we need to see really if this new system solves a real problem. Third one is efficient provision of services. The blockchain architecture, again, because everything gets on one ledger, can eliminate the need for intermediaries, which can add cost and add complexity to systems. So this is a pilot program done by the UN World Food Program. They are providing cash transfers to 100,000 Syrian refugees in refugee camps in Jordan, where they need to provide them with these direct cash transfers that they can then spend at stores in the refugee camps. And they're doing it by recording that on a blockchain ledger. Makes it incredibly secure, and again, provides this foundational platform. Right now, it's just the UN World Food Program running this blockchain, but they can then bring in other organizations, even private actors, and layer on additional functionality where the people are in control of their information and it's on a decentralized ledger. And this kind of mechanism can be used for any kind of government procurement system or the process of providing services and providing value out to people. Fourth one is compliance, similar to what you just heard about. There is great potential in the field of RegTech, regulatory technology. And blockchain, first of all, eliminates some of the intermediaries. So I've got a workflow here about a tax example, where in the traditional system, many intermediaries and steps that need to be gone through in the process of tax collection. Putting it all on one ledger potentially eliminates those. And it also creates this environment, again, where regulators can get direct access to the transactional data. Because, again, there's just one ledger. And so this potentially has great potential for a whole variety of regulatory contexts where, again, traditionally the process of keeping track of activity was something that had to happen after the fact. And finally, there is tremendous experimentation in new kinds of applications. So I put up here a link to the city of Berkeley, California, is going to use blockchain to issue micro bonds, municipal bonds for a couple $1,000s at a time. Because blockchain-based systems using cryptocurrencies don't require centralized intermediaries, the value transfer happens directly, potentially allows for much more efficient transactions and allows for much smaller value transactions with direct maintenance and tracking of the information. These smart contracts, these basically automatically operating software applications on the blockchain, can be used to manage and track and implement the interest rate process and the repayment process and the securitization process of these bonds. So that's just one example. There are experiments around Internet of Things, experiments around electricity, microgrid trading, where again, the idea is putting everything on a platform and then allowing software applications on top of it makes government into a platform for new kinds of innovation. And there is a tremendous amount of this experimentation going on all around the world. I put up a Deloitte chart here, not for these guys. It's the best one I could find, even though it's about a year out of date, just showing some of the different experiments in many different jurisdictions in this area. Now, to wrap up, it's still incredibly early. Many of these will fail. But if you could go back to 25 years ago, early 1990s, and you knew what the internet was going to become, not just for the private sector, but pretty much everything that we've been talking about this whole day has to do with either government making data available over the internet or government systems which are accessible over the internet. It's been incredibly transformative across both the private sector and the public sector. So if you knew that kind of innovation was coming, what kind of bets would you make? Took 20 years for all this to unfold. Something similar will happen with blockchain, but we're at that point now where we can start to see the potential. And so therefore, this is the time for public sector agencies, as well as enterprises in the private sector, to start to experiment and figure out where the real opportunities are, where this technology can actually solve problems in new kinds of ways. So that's where we are today, and it's a very exciting time. Thanks very much.
Thank you for presenting. That was really inspiring. I want to invite everyone who has questions to come up to the mic. I'm going to start off with a few that were given to me from the audience while you were speaking. So blockchain seems, at least the way it is today, that it requires a lot of data storage and computing power. What do you think are the probabilities that it can scale efficiently?
Scaling is one of those technical challenges that I alluded to, where there's a great deal of fundamental computer science work being done on it. But this is where it's important to distinguish, as I did, between Bitcoin, these what are called crypto economic systems, and the larger blockchain technology. So systems like Bitcoin, because they're open and accessible to anyone, use this process called proof of work or something similar, which is the mining process, where people spend literally billions of dollars a year and huge amounts of electricity to compete to verify these transactions. And there are big scaling challenges with that. There are big environmental challenges with that, about all the power that gets used. So there is a great deal of work going on to create new systems that are similarly secure, but don't have those limitations. And at the same time, there are these permission systems. Again, if you know who's on the network, if you're Walmart, you know everyone in your supply chain. You're not just going to say, well, anyone in the world could show up and be part of my supply chain. If you know that, you actually don't need to do all that proof of work. You can use different kinds of algorithms that don't have all those limitations. So it comes down to a question of what technical trade-offs you want to make and how important scaling is. But long-term, absolutely, I'm optimistic that the limitations that are there now are not permanent problems.
Thank you. And this is to Matthew and Jitinder. So can you tell us a little bit more about the machine learning methods that you use to create the regulatory map?
There's a technical person in the room. We appreciate that. We're using natural language processing tools and open source code primarily for those who are particularly interested in that, and we can certainly we can talk a lot more in depth about those things. I think I'd like to address that more importantly by saying that these are commercially readily available tools, and they're very accessible. They're very accessible to the data science community, it's really about how you apply those tools and work with the subject matter experts. We like to say, our data scientists sitting next to subject matter experts is where the value of these types of tools really rests. I certainly wouldn't want to create the impression that there's a particular magic or even proprietorship to what we've done here, other than, quite frankly, as Steve and his team have done, is taken publicly available data and applied tools to look at it in a different way and do activities against that data that, quite frankly, humans don't need to do anymore. And so we can apply our higher order skill sets to add more value to it. And I think that's where the real substance, quite frankly, of the tools really kicks in. It's by allowing humans to do what they do best.
And this is another one for Kevin. So when you're using blockchain for something like government accountability, what do you do about misreporting or errors if the ledger can't be changed?
So it's a great question, and it gets back to what I was talking to, for example, with the voting example. The blockchain itself is incredibly secure. So Bitcoin is a public $100 billion bank vault. It's out there. Anyone who could hack the Bitcoin network, it's $100 billion there today. No one has been able to do that in 9 years of trying. That's incredibly secure. However, tens of billions of dollars of Bitcoin have been stolen at the edges. And so similarly, the fact that information is recorded truthfully or accurately doesn't mean that the information is accurate to begin with. So what's starting to happen is for these kinds of systems, there is the development of various kinds of mechanisms to, for example, create governance. So what does it take to put information on the ledger? And then what happens if there's an inconsistency, if there's some problem with the information that's recorded? And it's possible to build into these smart contracts mechanisms for allowing changes after the fact. And part of the innovation going on right now is figuring out how many of these systems we can automate, for example, by creating incentive-based structures where you can actually create a contract that has an integral arbitration process, where basically there are two parties that each get a cryptographic key, and then you give a third key to the arbitrator, and it takes 2 of 3 keys to do the transaction. And so that allows that if both parties agree, if there's no dispute about the information, then you don't need the arbitrator, but if there is, the arbitrator can come in. So that's the kind of mechanism that can be deployed here. But absolutely, this is, the fact that it doesn't ensure the information is accurate going in. One big reason that I started with that notion that even though these are very real and very valuable public sector applications, just the fact that you can do something with a blockchain doesn't mean that you should, and it doesn't mean that we're yet at the point where the technology is mature enough to do that with a production system.
So this one's sort of bringing together one of our earlier panels on cybersecurity, and it wonders if blockchain has any sort of applications to solve problems with cybersecurity, and if you have any examples of someone trying to do that.
So as with everything else I described, sure, but the question we need to ask is it a better solution? So again, to the extent that, I described the Equifax example, if the cybersecurity problem is the data is in one place, that is a good target for attack, having a distributed system where there's no one who has control of the data can potentially be valuable for cybersecurity. On the other side, cryptocurrencies are bearer instruments. So if you have the cryptographic private key associated with those records on the blockchain, you're the owner of that information. So potentially that creates an even bigger cybersecurity risk, because once you get the key, there's no override mechanism built into the system. It goes back to what I said before, though, about building mechanisms into these blockchain networks that can address those limitations. But yeah, I think at a general level, again, because blockchain systems are based on what the cryptographers call a Byzantine threat model, every transaction is digitally signed. You are assuming that every participant on the network might actually be an attacker, not just the attack coming from the outside. That potentially leads to much better security hygiene, but it also creates new kinds of threat opportunities. So I would say yes, potentially, but as with everything else, that needs to be something that's intentionally built into these applications.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question. And I encourage you to come down and to the mics if you have some further questions. So there's a restriction on the size of the ledger for blockchain. So it seems how many of the applications is that going to be a problem to, or how is that going to get resolved?
Well, so again, there isn't a blockchain. We talk about the blockchain, kind of like the internet, but a blockchain is a network, and there are many different blockchain networks. There also are many applications that ride on top of different networks. And again, right now there's experimentation about the technical mechanisms of scaling these blockchain networks, and they make different trade-offs. So, for example, Bitcoin was designed for a fully decentralized private digital currency. And it trades off performance and scalability for those values. Other kinds of networks are designed for much higher performance throughput, but at a trade-off of some decentralization. And there's not going to be one solution for everything, and we don't even know really what the buckets of solutions are going to be, how many different basic networks and basic protocols there are going to be. So that's early, but there are a whole variety of techniques. If high scalability is a need to make these systems scale. And again, lots of computer science research and also lots of implementation work going on, for example, to create what are called layer 2 networks. So what's happening with Bitcoin is they're building something called Lightning Network, where the Bitcoin blockchain is the basic security platform. And then if I'm doing a bunch of transactions with a merchant, then I can essentially create a private channel that's much more scalable, but that leverages the basic security of the blockchain. That's just one of the approaches that are getting used, and that's a big area where a lot of the investment of companies and people in this space is going.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to welcome Kent to make some closing remarks. And,
Thanks again. I mean, well, we give them one last
Sorry.
round. That was great. It's 4:30 on Friday. I'm not going to keep people. Well, let me just say thanks so much for coming. We have feedback forms in your little packets. We'd love to get your feedback. We'll probably follow up with an email as well, what you liked, didn't like, and so forth, so we can improve things. But have a great weekend. And again, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Yeah. Good. I hope so. No, it's the end of a long day. But, yeah.